Okay, excellent. Hello, everyone. We'll make a start in terms of the workshop. If you could take your seats, please. We've also got a good, healthy online audience as well. Thank you, everyone, first of all, for being so flexible. I know we had a last minute change of location because of the snow, and I'm actually very impressed in terms of the number of you who managed to make it here in person today. I'll just provide very brief opening remarks, substituting at the last minute for our manager of the Global Facility for Disaster Risk Reduction from the World Bank, Niels, Holm-Nielsen, who was supposed to provide opening remarks, but we're having some technical difficulties. So really, we wanted to make a start on this workshop. So in terms of background, this is a workshop series now that we've been organizing. The World Bank team in collaboration with GW, Remy and Tana, for the last 3 years now. I think this is our 6th workshop. And the topic of today's workshop is on flooding in cities, impacts and policies. And the aim of this workshop series is really to bring together leading academics like we have here today with World Bank researchers, World Bank staff members and other policymakers to be able to have an exchange basically on issues of key concern to both communities so that we can learn from each other, exchange knowledge, bring knowledge into the World Bank, and also maybe give on the sort of academic side, a sense of the key policy questions that are kind of concerning us in the World Bank with our policy counterparts. And so this workshop, again, is very much in that spirit. I mean, flooding, of course, is a critical topic. We do see the risks associated with flooding are increasing, urban flooding over time, partly because of climate change, sea level rise, of course, but also the increasing concentration of people and assets in cities in flood-prone areas. And there is evidence that globally, urban expansion has been tending to occur in high flood risk areas. And so that's part of the motivation for focusing on this topic today. And so we are going to open up with a first session. Our chair for that first session is Zoe Trohanis. Zoe's online. I'm not sure if we can hear from Zoe to be able to open this session. Maybe over to you, Zoe.
Great, thanks. Hope you all can hear me. And I'm sorry I couldn't be with you there in person, but thanks to all for your flexibility due to the weather conditions. So my name is Zoe Trohanis. I'm the global lead for disaster risk management at the World Bank, based here in Washington. And it's really great to get to participate in an event like this where we hear both from researchers, academics, as well as from our operational teams bringing together issues around flood risk management in cities. And as Mark said, this is a critical issue for many of our client countries, especially in places in coastal areas and especially in cities where we have a lot of rapid unplanned development in areas maybe that hadn't flooded in the past, but are increasingly prone to flooding or along river banks. And so for me, this is an exciting opportunity to learn myself from a lot of your research and then to have a good, a productive dialogue among the teams. So I won't say much more. I think the meat really is in the discussion and in the richness of the analytics that we'll hear from our colleagues. So I'm going to invite Caps Riom, who's an urban economist at the World Bank, to kick us off with her work on urbanization and flood risks and evidence from global data. And then once Caps is done, we'll hear from Paul Carrillo, who's the professor of economics and international affairs at GW. So over to you guys in the room, and I'll do my best to try and moderate online, see how that goes. Thanks.
Great. Okay, so thank you everyone for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be presenting our work together today. So I'm Capucine, you can call me Caps, and I joined the bank in September. But before then, I had ongoing work with June and Paolo at GFDRR, and Luis Bernard, who's a co-author back at the LSE, where we were looking at one of the drivers of urbanization flood zones, land scarcity. But before I go into this, in the spirit of this conference, the idea is to first give you a bit of a taste for some global evidence that has emerged thanks to GFDRR and many teams at the bank on rapid urbanization in flood zones. I'll first present this for a few minutes, and then I'll, I won't be able to go into a lot of detail, but I'll tell you a bit more about our paper.
Yep, sorry, can you talk a little bit closer to the mic? It's really hard to hear you online.
No worries. Like this?
Yes, thanks.
Do some. Okay, is this good? Okay, so I can actually just look ahead. Oh, wow, this is great. Okay, can you hear me now? Perfect, okay.
Yep.
So I think many people in this room will already know this, but there are these global hydrological models that can be applied today at resolutions that are incredibly at incredibly high resolution. So we're talking 30 meter or 90 meter, where you can really see how cities around the world are facing flood risks. So in this case, on the left and the right is Colombo in Sri Lanka. And you see, thanks to these satellite layers of flood risk models, you see the risk that they're facing and the inundation depth that a potential flood for a given period will likely to be. And so this has been looked at for now like 5-10 years. But in the last few years, we've overlaid these satellite layers with population layers. So we now have a really good sense of where people are in your city. So by overlaying these two satellite data sets, you can see where the highest exposure is of people in a city. And so this reveals, many policy priorities. So when you look on the top bar chart is the world, you see that about 4.8 billion people don't face any risk. However, if you look at medium to very high flood risk, so we're talking floods that are between 0.5, so 50 centimeters and 1.5 meters or above, we're talking about 1.8 billion people worldwide that are facing these severe floods. In the bottom chart, we look at how that is distributed regionally, and you see that is primarily in Southeast Asia and South Asia, which account for 1.23 billion. So it's really a first order concern for all of us. Now, this is exposure, because it's also in terms of population living in these flood zones, are primarily in cities. And if you try and zoom into different cities, and a famous example in this report by Rentschler et al. Is Quang Nam in Vietnam. In 1885, you'll see on the left that this entire area is not really built on. It's along the floodplain. But as the cities expand, they slowly build on the higher risk zones. So the data allows us to look at all these cities around the world. And what Rentschler and al. Did in 2023 is try and really look globally and aggregate the speed of growth of existing settlements, the speed of growth that is in risky areas, and the speed of growth that is in safe areas. And you actually find that cities are expanding faster in very high flood risk. So, this should be raising alarm bells. In certain countries, think like Vietnam, the growth rate in risky areas is truly alarming. So we see a 300% increase in the growth rate from 1985. So not only are the latest trends worrying and the level of the problem quite large, but looking ahead, we think that these are really set to increase. So this is a recent paper on urban adaptation in South Asia that we're working on, the urban team there. And we're estimating how many people are exposed to flood risks between the urban centers, the semi-urban and rural. And you'll notice that all of these, the amount of people that are exposed to floods are all set to increase by 2050. So it's not about to stop. What can we do from there? So, you know, I think the next step really is to think about why this is happening and what can we do, right? I think the data will keep getting better. We'll keep having a more granular picture, but trying to get at the why and trying to have some type of typology to derive some policy implications is really where we should be going next. So already in some of these papers, you can find how classifications of slow risky growth or fast risky growth can lead to different policy implications. And I think this needs to be evidenced with careful policy and economic analysis. Okay, so we're 5 minutes into it. Okay, so now I'll turn to one of the drivers for rapid urbanization in flood zones. So the team, again, with Luis Bernard, June, and Paulo, we wanted to look to really identify one of the drivers. So there are different ways, you know, many different drivers we can all think about, but we wanted to try and do this in a causal way that would apply globally. So really the only driver that could be analyzed easily globally was a driver that we could measure with satellite data. The scarcity of you know, land use planning, et cetera, didn't allow us to go to study that. So we were interested in how land scarcity, so the lack of unviable or unsafe land around your city was actually pushing cities to go there, i.e. do they have just nowhere else to go? So, you know, this hypothesis was mentioned in different papers, including Alget's paper that showed that land scarcity and housing markets pushed poor people to settle in these riskier areas. This is Dharavi, Mumbai, I think many of you know, where the poor populations are living in the higher risk zones next to the city center. So what do we do in our paper? We first build a panel of cities from 1985 to 2015 as they expand, because we're interested in how many new settled pixels are in high flood risk zones. We look to start with 11 countries with a wide geographic distribution. And then the meat of the paper is to try and test for the role of land scarcity causally. So as I mentioned, land scarcity, we're interested in two types of land scarcity, whether it's on viable land, there's a lack of just land to develop on, or whether it's unsafe land, whether all the land in the vicinity is at high flood risk. And the center and the starting observation of this paper is really that if you look at it, you know, up top, helicopter view, if you look at a city and you look at the area around it, the amount of developable land or safe land is an endogenous product of urbanization. It's already the result of where the city founded in the first place. You know, cities would have tended to settle around riverbeds. And then the way that cities continue to develop, they are not just forced into an area, but they will also have some value in developing next to the river or next to the ocean. So we're trying to parse out between this directional growth of the city for the amenity value of that land versus the scarcity of the land. And so, yeah, I'll go into the results later on. Okay, so first, just to present to you the data very quickly, we use these global flood models in the name of Fathom, and we look at fluvial, so like river floods, rainfall floods, and floods from the coast. And then we look at a flood probability of 1 in 100 years, which tends to be quite large floods. And we look at two types of risk. So the severity is either very high, so above 1.5 meter, or moderate, between 0.5 and 1.5. The data that we use to look at the settlement extent is the world settlement footprint, which is a 30-meter resolution. And so we're interested in how a city is growing over time, and we're interested in two time periods. So between 1985, which is the settlement in orange, to 2000, which is the settlement in green, and the settlement in 2015, which is the pixels in red. So just again, for any urban economists here, you'll want to know this. I know I can't skip it, but we define cities as any continuous patch of settlement extent that is more than 1 kilometer squared. There are issues with this that we can discuss later on. And so we're interested in really the edge expansion of the city. We're not interested in, for example, leapfrogging or other types of development. Talking to urban planners, the way that urban planners tend to plan and have these town planning schemes is about a 10 to 15-year period. This is why we look at how scarce a city is in 85 and how that leads to risky development in 2000. And again, we look at how scarce a city is in 2000 and how that leads to risky development in 2015. So we're thinking about 15-year increments here. So the two types of land scarcity, again, for the definitions, we think about unviable land as any land that cannot be developed on. So water bodies, oceans, steep terrain. I know Albert Say's definition, who will be presenting later. So any land that is on a slope that's more than 50%. And then we look at high flood risk land, and I've defined this already. So this is just to give you a trend, so an idea of our dependent variable here, our outcome variable. So we're interested as the Y, the share of new settled pixels around your city that is located in a area with flood risk. We do it separately for coastal, fluvial, and pluvial, but we also do it for any risk, which is the section on the left. These three lines just say that we've actually looked at new settlements versus existing settlements versus settlements that are being absorbed, but in this paper, we only focus on existing settlements, so settlements that already existed in 1985. So our variation is about 10 to 15% every year of new land is actually in high flood risk. Okay, so how do we define our main independent variable, land scarcity? So how do we think about that? This was pretty tricky and led to many conversations. This is how we define it. So think about the land scarcity in 1985. So how constrained that city is in orange here. And we use the realized, so the observed sprawl that happened 15 years later, but by 2000, as a proxy for how far urban planners were looking towards when they were planning their city. I.e., because the city hasn't built any further, no urban planners were looking for land that was further. So we're only looking at, so we're defining the land around a city as this minimum bounding circle of the future city footprint. So we're looking at any land that is in this light green circle, removing the settled pixels, and we look at how much of that land is either unviable or at high flood risk. And then we're interested in what share of that is driving settlements into high flood risk zones, so of those green pixels. So yeah, to fix ideas, the type of regression that we'll be interested in is the share of new settled urban pixels in high flood risk. And we're interested in these beta 1s and beta 2s. How much is the share of unviable land around your city and the share of high flood risk around your city driving you to actually expand in that high flood risk zones? But we're worried about the endogeneity of those beta 1s and beta 2. So as mentioned before, to go very quickly, there are two forces that are driving cities to go there. They're expanding, and maybe in this case, they're expanding along the lake for some type of fertile soil or for some other amenity values. But they could also be expanding there because of the push constraints of those mountains in gray that are not allowing it to go away from the flood zones. So there are these two push and pull factors that we try and dissociate. The way we do that is we first take a long difference specification to remove the original location. The bias has to do with the original location of the city. And then we create an instrument to predict the type of land scarcity that the city would encounter if it followed a monocentric city model of urban growth. So this is following Nina Harari's Cities in a Bad Shape paper. And for the interest of time, I won't be spending a lot of time explaining to you every fine detail of this instrument. But the idea is that instead of solely looking at the actual constraints that the city is facing, we're looking at an instrument of the city shape and looking at all the land around it. So the type of land scarcity that we're capturing is actually the result of land scarcity that a city is kind of a mechanical city growth model is bumping into as the city expands. Okay, so in terms of the results, I'm only going to present to you two results here. The first is, so the impact, so we show that the scarcity of safe land around the city causes an expansion into high flood risk. So, despite the instrument, as you will have seen, is a slightly, is the result of this mechanical city growth model. So it won't be facing as many of the constraints that the city is actually facing. We're saying that the prediction from these more exogenous constraints is still leading the city to grow into high flood risk. So we think that this is, if anything, a conservative estimate of how much the land scarcity is pushing your city into high flood risk. And by not removing the endogeneity that we spoke of, the coefficient would be 3 times as large. The second result that I want to show you is this evidence of this substitution. So one of the worries, or one of the questions, is whether cities are expanding into high flood risk because they don't really have the right information at the right time. For instead of moving into high flood risk, they move into moderate flood risk or low flood risk. But it actually seems in our regressions, again, from 11 countries and all the cities in those 11 countries, that there's some type of substitution. So in this second row here, we show the share of moderate flood risk around your city is actually leading to less growth in high flood risk areas. So there seems to be a learning here. However, this is still something that should be worrying as cities are going more and more towards high flood risk. This will be an option. This won't be an option for very long.
Caps, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap it up in a minute or two.
Okay, perfect. Well, we're there. So basically, just to wrap up, as you suggested, so we find that scarcity of safe land is causing expansion into high flood risk land. We don't find, it's not that we find no evidence of it, but we don't find evidence that this scarcity of viable land is causing this expansion. And we find this substitution between moderate and high flood risk land from urban planners. And so the policy implications of this work, I think the main policy implication to take away from this is that there is some type of path dependence. We think, again, that ours is a bit of a low bar, so that cities are being locked in and have nowhere else to go. And so as moderate flood risk will be less and less available, there's a real importance of policymakers investing in adaptation technology, levies, insurance, et cetera. Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.
Great. No, thank you. So maybe, Paul, if you're there in the room, I'll hand it over to you to provide a few remarks. And also just to say, there are questions online coming in, so we will also move to those, and of course, those in the room after we hear from Paul.
Hello. Okay. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you so much for the very nice presentation, Cap. I don't know how you managed to wrap up all this amazing work in 20 minutes. I only have 5, so I'm going to focus on the academic paper, and hopefully these comments are useful. So how do I move it? Okay. So the main question of this paper is, how does land scarcity force cities to expand into these high flood risk areas? And the authors have done a magnificent data effort, right? I think I put here 4,000 cities. I don't know where exactly I got this number. It's on the paper, but I think you showed us that you have actually 11,000 cities. And importantly, you are trying about causal mechanisms. So the authors put a lot of effort trying to tackle this to tackle causation, construct a very well and well-crafted instrument. And if you ask me one takeaway from the paper that I took, I know that there are many lessons from this paper that one can get, but I think that there is an amenity value in these areas. People go to these flood risk areas not just because land is scarce, because they are amenable, right? You are close to the river, you may have one nice view, or there could be some production amenities. So we need to think about the policy implications. So there's role for adaptation, for planning, for infrastructure. All right. So impressive data effort, you thought about causal identification, policy relevance, so great things. So what are going to be my comments? I mean, I'm piggybacking on your last point, right? You're missing vertical development. And that's actually important. In the picture that you showed us, you have these huge skyscrapers and then you have just a flat development. So we just don't care about the extensive margin, right? We care about the intensive margin. We care about the total number of people who are going to be affected by this. And interestingly, you actually can do something about it, right? So Remy has worked with this GHSL data. You can use, build up area, building heights, and population density measures. You can overlay with your own satellite data. And I think this is the low-hanging fruit. I know that it's easier said than done. There's lots of actual work involved in doing this, but it can be done. So I think that's a natural extension of your paper. Not so easy extension is to think about formality versus informality. And I think that's also important. You look at that picture and then you tell us, okay, this is the formal market, and then you have the slums. And it's not clear whether in your sample of cities, you are mixing oranges with apples. And this might be a little harder to do. Maybe, I know that for Brazil, there's some work where people actually can identify what's informal, what's not. There's some great papers in Chile that have been tracking slums over time. I don't know if you can learn something from those papers and try to think about that, but I think that's another issue that I would think about. I think then I know this is a conclusion for the paper, but I think it could also be, in the mind of the reader, some cities may already have been, taken this into account, right? Especially in China. The Chinese government is very smart. They might allow all the expansion of the cities, but there may be some infrastructure that prevents that, and you are not accounting for that. So I don't really know how to tackle this other than maybe thinking about some heterogeneity analysis, grouping cities that are more likely to adapt, right? If you have the Netherlands, that's a different animal than, I don't know, China or, so that's something to think about that I'm not exactly sure how to solve, but I think referees and readers are going to think about. And the last set of comments that I have is that, I know that it's very tricky to define, what is the set of area that I can actually expand. But I didn't like the fact that that green circle was exposed. I think there may be some endogeneity going on there. I don't know, some robustness checks with the alternative definition would be nice. Perhaps you already did this, but I couldn't see it in the paper. And I also think that, the vast majority of cities come from China. But China is so different than the rest. And some countries are just so different than other countries. Some countries may have slums, some others don't, some others have infrastructure to prevent flooding, some others don't. So heterogeneity is going to be key here. I don't know, maybe you can write a paper just on China and maybe push that idea and push those results for that particular setting. And the one question that I was hoping to read in the paper was this very last one, right? Comes to me, okay, insurance, right? Yeah, we think about infrastructure, but we can also think about insurance, right? How can insurance help us alleviate this? So that was a great paper, lots and lots of work. I think I'm late already, so I'm going to stop there. Thank you for the opportunity again.
No, thanks, Paul. That was great. A lot of good questions. I think maybe Caps, if you want to come back up, there were a couple questions online I want to share with you. And then Mark has kindly agreed to field the room as well, and then you can respond. Yeah.
Yeah, I can just respond to your comments to start with. Thank you so much first. So the first thing about vertical expansion, there's the same data set, World Settlement Footprint 3D, where they're starting to develop this data. But actually, right now, you cannot have building height that is the whole that is our whole panel. So because our entire instrumental strategy relies on these long differences, we couldn't run the same causal estimation strategy with vertical as of now. But I think that is, I agree with you that would be really important. On informal settlements, also, again, the resolution of where the informal settlements are is not also global yet. So I think I would love to do that at this for one city, let's say, or for a few cities where the informal settlements exist. But again, we couldn't have that data for all our cities. The third point was about adaptation. So 100% agree. One of the big questions also with a lot of this work is that we're using undefended flood risk models. So assuming that there aren't flood defenses there because the flood defense data sets are so poor. So even within one same country, even look at the UK. If you take the UK, developed country, a lot of money, their flood defense data set is incredibly poor. And, Stephen will know that the flood defense data set in Vietnam also is like pretty patchy. So even at the country level, once you start accounting for the flood defenses that are there, you might be introducing more issues than you're removing, which is why a lot of papers are using undefended. But that's a massive problem. I agree with you. And maybe heterogeneity is a good way to go about it. And just to finish on your last points we actually started only with China. But we weren't allowed with the World Bank to publish just a report on one paper. So we had to extend the sample, and it's very lopsided because China has so many cities. I very much agree with you. I can't remember yet, but yeah, anyway, yeah. Thank you so much for all your comments.
Great. So maybe, Caps, I'm going to share a couple questions. I don't know if you can see the online questions. And then we'll go to the room very briefly. Is that fine?
Please.
Okay, so the first question said the messages, so thank you for the presentation. The messages seem self-obvious. Can we dig a bit more into the policy implications? So what are the factors to address in shaping where and how cities grow while still reducing flood risk? So that's the first. And then the second is very simple. Is there a link online? Is this paper publicly available for people to review? So those are the online.
Maybe that will take two questions.
Of course.
And then you can answer three. So the questions from Claude, we've got basically two questions, Remy, and then for the.
I didn't fully get why people are moving into this high risk zone. Is it that amenities are better? You do something at home. You were talking like about the fact that people want to be close to water. Was it just land is cheaper? It's like a land market mechanism? Or is it that the land can be invaded more easily? Like the government doesn't care, people move into these areas. So if you can talk more about the mechanisms. And I think I like the question about insurance markets. I think of the US in the early 20th century, 19th century, before you had insurance markets and all that, before you had good urban institutions. Did we have the same issues in the US? And how do you resolve these issues over time? And what does it tell us about policy?
Thank you both for obviously presenting your research and for your comments. My question really has to do again kind of with going off of your point of informal settlements, and what I think is really interesting is just the settlement and expansion into these higher risk areas, just because for many people they can no longer afford to live in the highly dense urban areas. So I wanted to ask, what policy proposals do you think, on an economic level, that could indirectly help this, right? How do you, what economic policy measures could be put in place, to help, people actually stay within the lesser risk areas and avoid moving out to higher risk areas altogether?
Thanks, everyone. I agree with the first comment that the policy implications are very obvious. And I think it was still very hard to establish whether the driver was actually had some type of causal impact. And in terms of the policy implications, I think it would circle back to the slide at the end of the first semi-presentation, which is probably as the evidence stands right now, what could be useful is a type of typology of a type of cities and which ones tend to be growing into high-risk zones and which ones tend to be leading fast into high-risk zones. So, and then carving the policy implications for each of those. And so there's the matrix of policy implications that I showed in those slides, where you can think a bit, not based on a lot of evidence, because this is this is still new and there's not a lot of good causal work out there, but you can at least play with policy implications that are specific to different typologies. In terms of, is the paper available? It's not available, I'm sorry. We're still running many different heterogeneity tests for different flood depth, severity, but we want to put it out very soon, actually, one first version. So do email me so I can send you the paper first. And then, yes, in terms of the what is pushing cities to build into high flood risk, I agree with I think all of them could be indicators. And, for instance, like prices is something that is so absent in our paper as it stands by design. It's a real limitation. So I think, unfortunately can't speak much to that with the paper. And then in terms of, I think you were saying so is your question that some people are being forced into these high flood risk zones from the city center? You're saying there's like a relocation within city towards the higher, is that your concern?
Yeah, exactly the, expansion into, these higher risk areas, to create more affordable housing eventually, right? What are the policy proposals to prevent that altogether, potentially, economic, to make it so that, those urbans are affordable to begin with, so that development is not necessary.
Yeah, I know there's different work being done more on slum rehabilitation and creative redevelopment to maybe build a bit higher, but to really look at these types of policies, I think you need to have some type of general equilibrium models to understand all the different equilibrium effects, which Stephen will be presenting some type of model like this, so maybe he'll be able to speak about it a bit more. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. That was great, Gaps. Thanks for a good discussion. Okay, so let's move on to our next speaker. So coming up now, I'd like to invite Yunji Kwan, who is assistant professor in the Department of Finance at the University of Cincinnati. Go Bearcats. The unintended consequences of post-disaster policies for spatial sorting. So if you can come up, please. Great to hear about your work. And to those online, please continuing putting any questions into the chat for the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you for inviting me to present this paper, and then thank you to the organizer, Mark, Remy, and Tanner for organizing this workshop. My name is Yunji Kwan. I'm an assistant professor at the Cincinnati, and then this is a joint work with Marcel and Bia, who is at Bern and Pungfeld-Faber, respectively. So before I start my own paper, I wanted to motivate this sort of like a fact that is known, probably something that you might have thought about it at some point in your life, that there has been many documentation that a lot of disaster relief or any kind of public policies has been used for the electoral incentives. So according to the World Bank report in 2022, 154 counties during the COVID-19, they sort of spend a lot of money on the social assistance spending, and then it's documented to be affected by the electoral cycle. And also there has been a lot of study, including the case study in Bihar and Kerala, that the disaster responses and reconstruction efforts are politically beneficial. So the question here that in this paper is trying to answer is, okay, we might need this government intervention post-disaster is needed because we need to address the market failure, and then the disaster is not just enough to be dealt in the market enough. So there's a market failure problem, so we need a government intervention. But at the same time, such effort can be also create another type of externality. So what are we losing here? So this paper is trying to answer this like very generally applicable question using the US county as a sample. We are looking at, and then the motivating fact is if you look at the counties between 1969 to 2019, the hurricanes that were hitting during this election cycle. So in the US, every other year, there is some sort of the election going on. So this year, last year in 2024 was a presidential election. And then in a year, there will be another Congress and more like a localized election going on. So the fact is these hurricanes, which was happening during this election year, was growing faster, 42 percentage points faster than the counties hit during non-election years. So we are starting from this fact that, okay, what is going on in terms of the disaster and then the electoral cycle. There has been many great papers which is documenting how the electoral incentives shape the resource allocation. So for example, politicians increasing spending more before elections, and then that's because voters reward disaster relief by voting whoever the candidate is bringing more money into their town. And at the same time, there's a separate literature which is looking at how this resource allocation through the public policy affects the spatial sorting of the economic activity. So in a plain term, if there is more money poured in one location, and people like to live there, or maybe the area is getting better, so that's gonna bring more people into the location. So given that the population growth is like fixed, some area is growing more than the other area. So in this paper, we are sort of combining this two idea that do electoral incentive affect the spatial distribution of economic activity in the context of the post-disaster? And if so, how much can we quantify the effect in terms of the welfare perspective? So these are the two main questions that we are answering in this paper. So we are looking at the hurricanes in the US between 1969 to 2019, and how we are sort of focusing on this electorally motivated public policy after hurricane versus not is in the following way. So as I said, election is happening every other year. So every even year, there's some big election going on in the US. And then when the election is going to happen is fixed at the first Tuesday of November. Whereas at the same time, hurricane season is from June to November, mostly concentrated around the November. So given in a county, whether this hurricane is going to hit during the election period, like a year before the election versus not, is arguably random. So we are basically comparing the hurricane that is happening during the election year versus not, and then have this on-cycle hurricane, which is happening during the election year, as politically motivated the hurricane. And then later, I'm going to be very brief on the model side that we are quantifying this impact by using this very well-established literature, which is a dynamic spatial GE model. And then we are extending this model to actually quantify what is the welfare impact. I'll be very brief about it. So what do we find? We find that this electoral cycle impacts on the size of the public good provision and then the population sorting. So during the on-cycle year, there are much more money poured in compared to the counties that is not hit by the hurricane, or compared to the counties that is hit by off-cycle hurricanes. And that more money is bringing more people in. And then by using this model, what we document is that it's causing the welfare losses. And then the intuition of the model is because one area is getting excessive money because of this election cycle, there are more of amenity development is going on, even after compensating all the destructive effect of the hurricane. So that's why people are sorting into their area. So what's happened to the rest of the country is they're losing population. So some counties that are more productive, which we would like more people, they're losing population, but we are concentrating too many people in the hurricane affected area during the election cycle relative to the outcome that didn't have election cycle impact in a counterfactual world. So that's how we are doing with a model, but maybe at the end, I'll be a little bit more clear on what do I mean by that. So how does a disaster policy works in the US is as follows. When there is a big disastrous event in the US, which is defined as $500 million, more than $500 million event, then a local government can address this disaster relief fund, which is funded by Congress and managed by FEMA. So even though in theory, FEMA should work based on the function that they have in terms of damage function and everything, there always is sort of a room for local politicians to aggressively reaching out to the federal level agency. And also final approval is coming from the president's side. So there is like a two side of the political incentive that is going on surrounding this post-disaster policy right now in the US. So even though we need this kind of post-disaster policies to address the market failure that market cannot address enough, but also there are some components that could potentially impact this impacted by the political decision. So going back to the hurricane definition, so these are what we call this on-cycle and off-cycle hurricanes. So this x-axis is how many days left to the general election, the first Tuesday of November every even year. So there are enough of probably 3 to 6 months before the election, there are some kind of hurricane coming up. And then there are probably more than a year left election, and then there are some kind of hurricane going on. So we are defining this hurricane that is close to the election as on-cycle hurricane, hurricane that is happening every even year as off-cycle hurricane. And we do a lot of balance check, and then they are pretty well distributed in terms of the damages to the GDP or the wind speed, kind of that. And then this is what it looks like in terms of the on-cycle and off-cycle hurricanes. So blue is off-cycle, orange is on-cycle, and then we can see that the distribution is pretty random. So at a given county, whether this year I'm gonna hit by this hurricane or not is arguably random. So we are comparing this to kind of a hurricane. So how to define the treatment and the control group? If you have work on this domain, then it's always like a lot of discussion to how to define the treatment and the control group. As our main specification, our treatment definition is county. If the county is hit by a major hurricane for the first time, then we're gonna define that as a treatment. In our paper, we have really extensive robustness check. If you like, and then on average, the definition of the treatment really doesn't govern our results. For the control group also, the tricky part is because we are looking at 1969 to 2019, which is 50 years window. So if you think about counties that is hit by the hurricane versus not, then always there, you can already imagine that these are two different counties. So as our main specification, we are focusing on the not yet treated as a control group. If you have followed the staggered definitive literature, then probably you might understand what is going on. But the idea is we are within this sample, control groups are the counties that are going to be treated at some point, but in a given year, it wasn't treated yet. So it's called not yet treated as a control group. So we are also, the results are also robust to using never treated, which is closer to the coastal distance, and the results are pretty robust. So with this, what are we doing? So really the biggest challenge is if we start to regress our outcome variable on the hurricane, then the hurricane always brings some sort of the public spending. So even if we are interested in, say, impact on the population, it's really hard to entangle pure disaster impact, pure disaster intensity from how much it is driven by the government intervention. So that's been always challenging in the literature. So we are trying to overcome that idea by decompose the specification into the cycle effects and then damage intensity. What I mean by that is this gamma SD, which is gray, is going to be about the damage. So if the DI is the intensity of the damage, and then this indicator variable is whether there was a hurricane in that year or not. So this part is going to handle that how much of this outcome variable effect is going to be if the disaster damage is severe. And then the first two term is where we're more interested in, that this gamma on, this orange term, is going to be the dynamic effect of a on-cycle hurricane. And then we interact that with whether this is happening in an even year. And then this gamma off, the blue coefficient, is going to be the dynamic effects of the off-cycle hurricanes that are not explained by this damage part, which is gamma D. So going forward, I'm going to show you two graphs, but I'm going to mostly show you this on-cycle and off-cycle, the differential of these two coefficients. So what do we find is this population results, the very differential destiny of the population between on-cycle and off-cycle counties. So conditional on the damage, how much of the damage that they are getting, we can see that once the hurricane is hitting, then the on-cycle hurricane is increasing the population overall in a county that is hit by on-cycle hurricane, whereas off-cycle hurricane is decreasing in terms of the population. And then why is it so? We argue that this is driven by how much of the post-disaster effort the public spending is spent. So this on-cycle hurricane, right after the hurricane hits, in addition to whatever on average this the local government is providing in terms of the rescue disaster fund, there is an additional jump in this public spending during the on-cycle time. And then overall, there is a decrease, a lot decrease in the off-cycle time. There is a decrease in the public spending. So in our paper, we do a lot of effort to understand what is going on behind the scene. But one thing that, before I move on, and that we have in our paper, what are the spending categories of this post-disaster policy? And then we document that a lot of them is this place-based policies, just such as sanitary engineering, flood engineering, or park and recreation. So there are a lot of money poured in towards this place-based policy. So we really argue that this is mainly driven by the political incentive during the on-cycle versus off-cycle. So how do we argue it? First, we document that this differential impact between on and off is causing for the disaster more than 500 million in damage, because that's when the local government started to claim for this disaster fund. And secondly, which is probably more convincing and interesting, is these effects are more likely to be driven in a county that had the local political partisanship is aligned with incumbent presidents. So meaning that if the county is more likely to be a red county, then and if the president incumbent office is Republican, then there's likely to be this cycle effect much more so. And then thirdly, also it is in a county that is higher turnout, and then also it's likely to be swing state, then this on-cycle and off-cycle effects are more pronounced. And also we document that these excessive local spending is driven from the intergovernmental transfer, mainly from federal. We cannot track where exactly it's from, but it's from most likely either federal to the local county or state to the local county. So a lot of this extra public spending beyond their collection of taxes is coming from the higher up level intergovernmental transfer. So with this, without going to too much of the detail of this model, we document that it seems like there's a political electoral effect of this post-disaster policy, and the population sorting seems to be different. And then if you believe our result, then it seems like during the election year, there are more money poured in, and then there are more population going into that area. Then what does it mean by, how can we quantify this overall effect? Because some areas losing, some areas gaining, then what is the implication of overall economy? So that's why we need a model to compare the economy with current electorally motivated post-disaster policies with the economy that we get rid of this electoral effect of the post-disaster policy, and how would have been the population distributed in this world that is absent of this political economy effect. So that's why we need a model. So we are building on this really well-established dynamic spatial GE model that every county is a location, that every county is linked based on the people's movement and the trade. And then every is a it's an equilibrium for every county. And then if you have followed this literature, it's a really cool, I love this model so much. And, and without going too much of the detail, we add two cherry on top to explain what we are doing. The first component is public policy component that the physical transfer reallocates based on whether there's an on-cycle or off-cycle. So we add public policy component on the top of it. And then we let the fundamental amenity and productivity, meaning that location has amenity and productivity part that if the amenity is better, then people love to live there. If the productivity is high, then you're gonna produce more productive things. So that's gonna draw more population in. But we let that affected exogenously by hurricanes. So if there's a disaster going on, amenity and productivity is destroyed. But at the same time, when the more money is poured in by the government, then the amenity and productivity can be revitalized. So these two are going on with the post-disaster policy. So what do we show is compared to the current equilibrium with disaster policies affected by this electoral cycle, if we compare the equilibrium with no electorally motivated post-disaster policy, we are basically drawing too much of the population, which is highlighted in red or orange, into this coastal area that is keep hitting by the hurricane. So what does that mean to the welfare and productivity? The idea is, okay, these areas are high amenity area, so people love to live here. So, and then the electorally motivated money is poured in so that more people can live here, and then this is even becoming a better place, so there's amenity improvement. But at the same time, the whole US is losing their population, and probably we would have benefited a lot from having more people in the more productive area. So as a whole, if we combine everything, that kind of trade off between these two effects, we are losing our welfare and we are losing our productivity. So this losing productivity part is so strong enough that it's canceling out the amenity benefit effect by locating too many people in really cool city, like a really cool place to live like Florida. On the top of that, what we are silent about it is we are just like taking this 50-year span as given, and that we are thinking about the hurricane that has been hitting at the rate of whatever the hurricane has been hitting. But there are a lot of discussion on whether climate change is real or the hurricane is real. And then what the argument that we have is this is probably the lower bound if you believe in climate change, because what is not accounted here is we are not accounting the fact that these people are more likely to be hit by the hurricane once the hurricane started to destroy this area more often. So this is sort of the welfare depreciation is sort of a lower bound in our opinion that we didn't account for in this model. So to conclude, hopefully I could convince you that electoral motives may alter the spatial distribution of the physical activity and then thus trigger inefficient sorting of the responses. And even though we agree that to address the market failure, we might need a post-disaster intervention, but this politically driven post-disaster intervention is making things inefficient because there is a spatial spillover. So what is the take for the policy implication? We argue that the disaster relief should be apolitical, but this is very, very, very strong statement, and then I believe that it's really hard to achieve, to be honest. So, but in an ideal world, we hope that the disaster aid is allocated based on the actual need and severity of disaster, instead of there are some room for local government or the federal government started to affect this the decision to how to fund it, how much we are going to fund it. So where are we at least in the US, if you have followed the news, there's an active discussion whether the FEMA should be eliminated. And then, of course, like we are not arguing that current FEMA form is the most effective form, because like we are showing the result that this is still very politically driven, even though there is a FEMA in the middle as a sort of supposedly apolitical agency. But as I said in the beginning, there are always room for local politician and then the federal government influencing this decision. But if FEMA were to be eliminated, then I think that its responsibility would be transferred to either newly formed agency. Probably a president will make a new agency to deal with all this like disaster, or through the direct presidential authority, which I think current government is trying to do, which potentially increase the presidential discretion in disaster relief allocation. So I think where we are heading to is actually very dangerous direction according to our research. So with that, let me conclude, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Many thanks, Inji. Yeah, it's hard to say what's going to happen now in the current political climate in the United States. But very interesting study. So just to note online, I've been checking, we didn't have any questions, just one asking for all of the presentations, which I confirmed we will share after the event. So Mark, I hand it over to you to take any questions from the room, as we don't have June there as a discussant. So over to you, Mark.
Thank you so much, Zoe. Thank you. I guess one potential solution for the problem is to delegate the disaster relief to the World Bank.
Can you talk in the mic? We can't hear online, Mark.
So, but joking aside, let's turn to take some questions from the floor. If there's any questions, okay, 2 questions. So let's take those 2. Paul.
So quick question. So quick question. What does the model say about the optimal response policy when there's a disaster? I mean, you say that it should not depend on the electoral cycle. We know that, but should it be enough to come back to the same level of amenities, or should it be below it, taking into consideration, potential flooding risks?
Take sets of questions together. Tana?
Yeah, I have like a very related question. Like at the beginning, you motivated this by saying there's market failures, so we need a body like FEMA. The government needs to intervene. So another counterfactual would be, what would be the market response here? What would welfare look like in that situation?
Right. Any more questions? Rani?
Because Matt Kahn is not in the room, I'm going to talk for him. And he always says that, we should live in mobile homes in Florida. And so every time there's a disaster, we'll drive away from Florida and then we can come back. So it's all about the durability of housing. So how do you think of durability in your model?
So thank you for all the comments. And then for the optimal disaster location, I think we didn't think about the optimal, but I think you're right, that your intuition is right, that maybe it should be enough to just compensate the disaster destructive portion, but at the same time, we shouldn't overcompensate it. But we actually didn't run a counterfactual thinking about this really optimal, because the focus of the paper was like trying to understand.
Okay,
yeah.
Investing in the other area. Maybe it just adds up.
Right.
Right. I don't know. That's
right. So I think it's somewhere in between the two. All we are saying right now is like we are comparing the equilibrium that has like this political effect versus not. So we cannot really say about, okay, how is it like, what is the optimal level? But I think we can give some more thoughts on the counterfactual exercise. So I think that's a great point. And then, did I answer your question or so?
Yeah, well, basically, like, what would be the counterfactual? There are no government.
Right. So I think that disaster is destroying the effect. So I think some of the again, like going what we were saying, some of the transfer is going to compensate, but it's I think we need to revisit our counterfactual again, and then like really think about how much is the function of the damage the damage of the hurricane that we have. But I think as of now, I don't have a good answer, but that's like certainly a direction that we really need. And then with the housing side, what we try to document is, because again, like we are trying to focus on this on and off cycle, we didn't see any of the differential reaction in this housing regulations side during on and off cycle. So that's why we were very quiet about the housing in the model. But certainly, I think it's a bigger question that we didn't answer, and then which I always am thinking a lot about is, okay, I think what is the optimal level of population who are living there, given that this is going to be distributed? I think it's a combination of migrating people away from the harm, but at the same time, we need to build the house more resilient or maybe easier to manage, so that even if people are living there, we want to reduce this the negative effect of the disaster. But at the same time, we don't want too many people to live there, and that we are investing too much on the resilience if it's not working. So there always is a question of adaptation or migration, which in our paper is not really talking about. But I think that's actually my future agenda, that I want to dig more and then like start to really think about the resiliency versus migration, adaptive migration. So yeah.
So I think we've got time for one more question, if anyone's got a burning question. If not, we can go into the break, coffee break, and continue to discuss over coffee. Okay, so I think no takers, let's break for coffee. Thank you very much to everyone on this panel. Thanks, Zoe, as well.
Okay, perfect. So for our second session, our chair is also joining us online. We have Yoon-hee Kim, who is the practice manager for East Asia for the Urban DRM and Land team in the World Bank. Yoon-hee, we have you here on the screen.
Thank you. Can you hear me well?
Perfect.
Yeah, I think I heard perfect. Thank you very much. So welcome to the second session. So first of all, my apology for not being able to be there in person, but nonetheless, really delighted to moderate and chair the second session. It's a topic that really is so critical, which is urban flood management. So well, before I start, let me first introduce myself. I'm Yoon-hee Kim. I'm the practice manager for East Asia for urban disaster risk management and land. I'm usually based in Singapore, but currently in DC, a little bit snowed out at home. The topic of flood management is a really important area for our engagement. Almost all countries we work, we have engagement related to flood risk and resilience. It's also a topic that our clients are increasingly requesting support, not only sort of preparedness and response against the flood risk, but also how to build a longer-term resilience and adaptation against the increasing frequency and intensity of flood event in many of the cities that we work. So it's a really important topic. We work and provide support, financial support and investment in almost all countries that we work in East Asia. And increasingly, I think, analytical evidence and research, innovative research is really important to inform our guide our dialogue and policy dialogue with our clients. So I have two very exciting and interesting presentation. So we have a case from Indonesia, more specifically Jakarta, and then we have Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. So I have the pleasure to introduce Professor Alan Shao, who is the assistant professor at the Stanford at the Econ department. And he's going to present sea level rise and urban adaptation in Jakarta. And it's like really excited to hear about his research work. And then our colleague, Burbank colleague, Luis Trevino, who's a senior urban development specialist based in Jakarta, will come and share his thought and comments. And then we'll open up for Q&A. And then the second presentation will be done by our colleague, Stephen Rubini. He's our senior DRM, disaster risk management specialist at the bank based in Hanoi office. And he will discuss his work on Tuduk City in broader Ho Chi Minh City metropolitan area, and then he will discuss the ongoing work on flood resilience and sustainable growth for Ho Chi Minh City. So with this, I'm gonna hand over to Professor Lan Xiao, and then we get started. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Yoonhee, for the kind introduction. Please pull up this moment. There's actually a slight shift. My main sort of push in this area on sea level rise has been focused in Jakarta. My main work has been there. What I'm presenting today is a sort of offshoot of that stream of work. This is new data construction, new stylized facts for a new paper that's being printed this May in the AEA Papers and Proceedings. Here I'm going to put together a global data set, and so I'll talk you through that, and I'll touch on implications for urban inequality and urban adaptation as part of this broader body of. Mic is it touch loud? Is there a way to bring it down? Great. And so, we've talked about sea level rise. We're talking about projections of somewhere in the 0.5 meter to 1 meter range. What I want to note here is that in the very worst case scenarios, if the ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland move and melt faster than we expect, then we're talking upwards of 2 meters and even higher. That's global mean sea level rise. Cities, coastal cities, have a problem on top of that, which is land subsidence, which is the land itself sinking, such that the sea in relative terms is rising even faster. This sinking is happening between 5 and 15 millimeters per year in the worst affected cities in the world. So we're talking about something that is as fast as this 1 meter, 2 meter global sea level rise scenario. And so what I'm going to do in this particular piece of work is I'm going to focus on quantifying the exposure of urban areas, of urban cities, to sea level rise of up to 5 meters. And I'm going to do this at global scale. And so this is going to be very related to the work that CAPS presented also at global scale from this morning. But I'm going to differ in a couple of ways. First, I'm going to be really focused on urban infrastructure, schools, hospitals, the critical infrastructure in our cities and how exposed those facilities are to sea level rise. And I'm going to put together this data set using highly detailed geospatial data at global scale. This is new data covering more than 11,000 cities, almost 4 billion people, that is already available on my website. Data, the code, the paper are all currently available. Touching at the end on, as I mentioned, implications for urban inequality and urban adaptation, talking about the other papers in this stream of work that I've been. So as we're talking about urban infrastructure, what am I going to do here? I'm going to compile all what I think are the frontier spatial data sets for thinking about this issue. And I'm going to harmonize them all at very fine geographic resolution, 30 meters by 30 meter pixels. I'm going to have city boundaries from the global human settlement layer that was touched upon before. I'm going to have frontier global coastal terrain data, elevation data, from what I think is the best digital terrain model to think about how exposed particular plots of land are to sea level rise, because some are higher and some are lower. And I'm going to draw infrastructure data from OpenStreetMap, schools, hospitals, clinics, et cetera, as well as road infrastructure, transport infrastructure from the Global Road Inventory Project. And then to think about distributional effects within cities, poor neighborhoods, rich neighborhoods, I'm going to draw on nightlight data from the VIRS suite of nightlight. So first, what I need to do is I need to think about inundation and risk to inundation because of sea level. So I'm going to draw elevation data from this Delta DTM data set. These are elevation data derived from the Frontier Copernicus EU-led satellite measurement enterprise. Okay? But importantly, what this data set is going to do is it's going to remove forests and buildings from this elevation satellite-derived data. Because the satellites just measure how far the surface of the Earth is from the satellite. They measure the surface of the Earth, but it's inclusive of trees and buildings. And as we think about sea level rise, we want to pull that out. And then what I'm going to give you is a very simple model, the simplest possible physical model, I think, of sea level rise, where all I'm going to do is I'm going to combine the elevation data, are you above or below sea level, with one more basic hydrological principle, this principle of hydrologic connectivity. That is to say, are you below sea level and are you in the direct path of the ocean? Can the ocean reach you if the sea level rises? But with this very simple model, combined with very fine-grained elevation data, now I can say for every coastal city around the world, this plot of land within Jakarta, this plot of land within Washington, D.C., how exposed are these places to sea level at any given level of sea level rise? And I'm going to construct this up to 5 meters. So I'll show you first some maps for the 5 most exposed cities in the world, excuse me, the 5 most populous cities in the world. First is the greater metropolitan area of Guangzhou. This is again just drawn from the urban definitions, urban boundaries from the global human settlement layer, which is just clustering dense urban regions. And so the dark gray is the urban boundary. And then 2 meters, 3 meters, 4 meters, 5 meters of sea level rise. The red is where the sea can reach at that level of sea level. This is 5 meters, excuse me. You can also think about Jakarta. Jakarta is here. 0 meters, 1 meter, 2 meters, 3 meters, 4 meters, 5 meters. This is Dhaka in Bangladesh. You can see here a lot of the place that is prone to sea level rise is not actually within the urban boundary, but as you get to 4 meters, 5 meters, Dhaka is very exposed. There's 2 more maps. Tokyo is here, 3, 4, 5, right? Coming up through the mouth of the river here. And then number 5 is New Delhi. New Delhi is not exposed to sea level rise, but it's in my data set nonetheless. So I'm going to skip to number 6, which is Shanghai. Shanghai is one of the most exposed cities in the world. At 5 meters, more or less, the entirety of Shanghai is at risk of inundation. So that's inundation. This is the places spatially at very fine-grained geographic scale within a city that are exposed to inundation from sea level rise. But my focus here is on infrastructure, on urban infrastructure. So from OpenStreetMap, I'm going to have education infrastructure and health infrastructure, core human capital infrastructure in our cities. And then I'm going to have all kinds of schools, middle, primary and high school, kindergartens, colleges, universities. Health, I'm going to have pharmacies. What I'm going to show you today, I'm just focusing on schools, hospitals, and clinics. For roads, I have all the roads, highways, primary, secondary, tertiary, and then there are even smaller roads, but then that sort of took too long to compute, so I cut it at tertiary roads. What I'm showing you today is summary statistics just on these biggest roads. In the data set that are available online, I have this inundation exposure measure broken down for each of these. And so in terms of what World Bank policymakers, what World Bank staff can say to policymakers, to the extent that World Bank staff are working with particular client countries or particular client governments, the kinds of statements that one can make with these data are as follows. For city X, at 2 meters of sea level rise, 15% of the schools currently built in city X will be inundated or are at risk of inundation. 20% of hospitals, 23% of pharmacies, 18% of primary. So how am I going to think about inundation? All I'm going to do here is I'm going to ask the simple quantitative question: what percentage of urban infrastructure faces the risk of inundation? I have the city boundaries from the global human settlement layer. I have the geocoded infrastructure from OpenStreetMap and the Global Road Inventory Project. I have inundation by combining the frontier coastal elevation data set with this very simple physical model of inundation. And I'm just going to overlay all of them and tell you at each given level of sea level rise what percentage of schools are at risk. And then I'm going to aggregate across cities to give you global descriptives, weighting by population density, to account for, if you have 100% of this city, but it's very sparsely populated, then maybe I don't want to weight that as much as inundation in a very dense city. There's an important asterisk here. This also came up in the discussion of the presentation that CAPS gave before. This is ignoring any kind of adaptation. This is ignoring current and future defense. And so there's a particular interpretation here, which is I'm showing to you the land and infrastructure that is at risk of inundation. I still think that's policy relevant. If the seawall breaks, we want to know how much of the infrastructure is going to be inundated in that. But as an asterisk, what I'm showing you today does ignore this. So there's one important takeaway. The first important takeaway is that Asian cities are particularly exposed to the risk of inundation from sea level rise. These are 3 scenarios: sea level rise of 1 meter globally, 2 meters, and 3 meters. And these are the top 10 lists. And so at 1 meter, 4.8% of Osaka's infrastructure, pooling across schools, hospitals, clinics, highways, and primary roads, are at risk of being inundated. Jakarta is number 2, Tokyo number 3. On this list of the top 10, only Lagos in Nigeria and then New York City, these are the only 2 non-Asian cities on the list. At sea level rise of 2 meters, Bangkok shoots to the top with 55% of the city's infrastructure being at risk of inundation. Shanghai we saw before, it's number 2 at 19%. Manila jumps up. Vietnam makes it onto the list at number 8 now. It enters the list. Again, Lagos and New York City are the only 2 non-Asian cities. At sea level rise of 3 meters, Lagos is the only one. So Asian cities are built in places with infrastructure set up in such a way that they are particularly exposed to the risks of inundation. And recall that these Asian cities are the cities where land subsidence is happening most rapidly in the world, most exposed and sinking the fastest. I can also think about distributional effects. I can think about poorer cities versus richer cities. And there's something interesting here, I thought, and was surprised by, although this is consistent, I think, with the Rentschler study that CAPS mentioned in the presentation before. It turns out that poorer cities are actually less exposed. Here, lower income is just going to be based on the country level GDP, the country that the city sits in. And so what we see here is in the sample of all cities, higher income are the solid lines, the dotted lines are lower income. And so what this is saying here is that, let's just focus on the red, just focus on the land. Lower income cities are less exposed to sea level rise, less exposed to inundation risk than high income cities are at all levels of sea level rise for all of these different sea level rise scenarios. The reason is relatively simple. It's just because higher income cities are more likely to be coastal. So when I subset to the set of coastal cities, when I just focus on coastal cities, the solid and dotted lines no longer diverge. Okay, for coastal cities, higher income coastal cities and lower income coastal cities are pretty much similarly, proportionately exposed to sea level rise. And then actually past 3 meters of sea level rise, it's the lower income cities that are more exposed. Okay? So overall, lower income cities are less exposed, but just because they happen to be less coastal. There's also something interesting here about the divergence between land exposure and infrastructure exposure. And so what you see here comparing the red and the black, red is land, black is infrastructure. Infrastructure rising less rapidly than land suggests that infrastructure is placed within cities on relatively higher ground. Otherwise, it would increase proportionally. You actually see this even more strikingly when I focus within cities on poorer neighborhoods relative to richer neighborhoods. Let me first look at neighborhoods in the full sample of all cities. And let me think about higher income versus lower income. Higher income is you have more intense above median night light intensity within the city. Okay, so all of this is defined, higher and lower income is all defined within each city. And what we see here, comparing higher income and lower income, in the sample of all cities, we see first for lower income countries that infrastructure exposure is quite a bit lower than land exposure. Okay, the dotted black line is below the dotted red line. Again, because in lower income cities, it turns out that infrastructure is not evenly spread across all of the land. It's concentrated in certain places that tend to be on higher ground. And so even if the land exposure, the overall amount of land in a city being exposed to inundation is increasing relatively rapidly, the exposure of infrastructure is increasing less rapidly. That infrastructure within the city is located on a higher ground. You don't see that discrepancy for higher income countries. Land and infrastructure more or less rise at equal rates. Because in these higher income countries, the infrastructure is spread more evenly across the neighborhoods within those cities. If I focus on coastal cities, the same divergence between land and infrastructure survives. And actually now it opens up as well for higher income countries, but to a lesser extent. So poorer neighborhoods within cities are also less exposed. Lastly, one thing to note here as well is that this acceleration of risk, this acceleration of exposure, as sea level rise passes 1.5 meters, and you can see it on all of the figures here, around up to 1.5 meters, the slope is relatively low, and then past 1.5 meters, things start to accelerate. So below 1.5 meters, the pace is slower and there are lower levels. At 1.5 meters, the mean exposure of infrastructure is 1.2% for all cities, almost 3% for coastal cities. Once you move past 1.5%, the pace picks up and you reach relatively high levels. At 5 meters, we're talking about 11% for all cities and 26.4%. Okay? 5 is about 3 times bigger than 1.5, but then 11 is about 10 times bigger than 1.2. There's a policy prescription here, which is that global mean sea level rise, just from the melting of the polar ice caps, is most likely going to remain below 1.5 meters by the year 2100. That is to say, what is it that is going to take a particular city past this 1.5 meter cutoff? It's going to be land subsidence. Land subsidence is expensive to manage, but there's a sense in which that land subsidence is local and within the jurisdiction and realm of possibilities for a particular city to address, especially in Asia, where again, the most rapidly subsiding cities are concentrated. So just one slide each on the other 2 papers in this broader stream of work. I also have this work here, by the way, is just a short 5-page paper. It's already available and out. This is also another short 5-page paper talking about the implications of sea level rise for inequality, asking the question of whether sea level rise will exacerbate inequality in coastal cities because of spatial sorting, where the rich within a city can adapt by moving to higher ground. But the issue distributionally is going to be that as the rich move to safe neighborhoods, they bid up the prices of those neighborhoods, and thereby, via this pecuniary externality, push the poor elsewhere into less safe neighborhoods. And so this short paper just puts together a very simple quantitative model of spatial sorting. This is going to be estimated just with data from Jakarta, a flood-prone megacity of 32 million. And what I'm going to find quantitatively is that sea level rise can double inequality expected over the next 50 years to flood exposure. Okay, and then I'll conclude with a short 1-slide summary of my main paper, my main kind of push in this sea level rise area, thinking about urban adaptation, particularly in Jakarta, where I ask the question of how this proposed $40 billion seawall can complicate long-run adaptation by potentially crowding out private adaptation, moving inland, and other sorts of private adaptation. And so there I'm going to have a sort of dynamic spatial equilibrium model, thinking about urban flooding and development, where the kind of methodological contribution is a very lightweight way to estimate the dynamics of the model that is going to draw on very granular real estate price data. And the upshot of this paper is just that there's a potential political economy-based moral hazard whereby developers, if they expect that the government is just going to bail them out, then there's nothing stopping developers from continuing to develop at the coast. And then after ex post, that development has happened and has been sunk. The government now has no choice but to bail the developers out. And so I talk about how that coastal lock-in, which delays inland migration, can be sort of mitigated with building a seawall, but also considering simultaneous investment inland to kind of reduce this friction. Okay, so to summarize, the main thing that I've talked about today is new work on a new data set on sea level rise and urban infrastructure, already available for download for 11,000 plus cities globally. One takeaway from this particular paper is that Asian cities are particularly exposed. Asian cities have big problems, but also lessons that are going to be able to help us to make progress elsewhere globally. And so then I leave you with the sort of key questions that I think are extremely pressing for policymakers and those of us who support policymakers. How can cities adapt, and what can governments do to help? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Shah. Really interesting finding, and also really great to know about this new data set. I was thinking what we might be able to do with the data, but also really fascinating findings and important policy questions that you posed towards the end. So I would like to invite Luis Trevino for as a discussant to share his thoughts, and then also drawing upon his work in Jakarta and Indonesia more broadly. So over to Luis. I don't know whether you can hear me well, but now I see Luis. Thank you very much. Yeah.
How are you? No, thank you. No, I don't have that. So thank you for inviting me, Mark, Nancy. This is great to see that we are having this type of conversation, because we have made a lot of strides on mitigation, but on adaptation we are playing catch up now. And I think it's great to have this, and Alan's work is great on this. This is, for me, this conversation is a little bit more than an intellectual challenge, because I live in Jakarta. So this existential threat is something I live with. This is 40% of the city is below sea level, and the annual losses caused by flooding are 300 million and above per year. It's probably much more because of the way they are measuring, but it is around that. So now on the key issues raised by the paper Alan mentioned on Jakarta, there is, the paper explores this relationship between commitment and moral hazard, right? So the main way it works is that the government intervenes, or the expectation of the government action is creating this moral hazard in the developers. And of course, this is not unique in Indonesia, right? It happens everywhere. And now what's the solution, right? Solution is a stronger commitment, right? This is, and of course, it's a very simple solution, but at the same time, not an easy solution, right? So how can we do that? And in the paper, there's a discussion on the complications posed by the political cycles and the budget and so on. No? So what can we do? No? So that's the main question there. Then on the other part, some integrated policies are proposed. So why don't you combine coastal defense measure with other policy? Why don't you do this manage aquifer recharge, like has been done in the US and in other countries, like in Mexico, in Shanghai also. So now this is also very, very good recommendation. Now, from just to give you an idea of magnitudes, the investment in the Great Seawall is around $40 billion, right? So out of which there's a substantial part that is still to be financed. The managed aquifer recharge for land subsidence is around between $1 to $2 billion. These two investments are expected to if you're keeping the numbers in your head, these two numbers are expected to generate operating expenses, annual operating expenses between $500 and $600 million a year, right? Now, how can you do that when the budget that the city has for urban infrastructure investments, or all infrastructure investments actually, is $1 billion a year, right? So that becomes a challenge when you have this 1 billion per year and you have other competing priorities and also other commitments like that, for example, the debt acquired for the metro, right, in Jakarta, no? Of course, I don't have the answers to these questions, but just wanted to put them there. However, there is one idea that we have been discussing, and I'm here because we are having this gathering of the urban and resilience and land team, and this is part of this, and we have been discussing some ideas about how can we make these numbers work in a way, right? And one of the things we have been discussing is that we need to break silos, because maybe if you see it as an isolated investment on flood protection, it doesn't make much sense. But if we see it as an integrated project that has multidimensional impact, then it may make sense. So flood protection, yes, but also economic impact, job creation, and so on, right? So, and now the key there is because you don't have that much public money, so how do you bring in private sector, no? And in the model, using the paper, the little I understood, because I dropped for the good of the economic science, I dropped my econometrics a lot of years ago. Alan is considering that the private sector is following the signal from the government, right? That's what it's doing, and since these signals are always imperfect and affected by all these considerations that we thought, that's where the moral hazard comes in, no? So, but what if they could work together, right? What if they can grow the pie and see and have in their own interest to actually do things together, no? So this is where we have been discussing in the last week. We have been discussing about PPPs. We have been discussing about land value capture mechanisms. So this is supposed to be, so the Great Seawall is expected to protect 1.5 million people and save in the future around $1.5 billion a year, right? But at the same time, it's going to generate 4,000 hectares of land. They expect that it's $2,500 per square meter. So there is a lot of value to be created there, right? And they are also expecting that there are from 5 billion and upwards. If the seawall is completed, it can generate foreign direct investment. It can generate more than 30,000 new jobs on this, right? So, and now you're talking, right? If we think of it that way, but then you have the mandates at that level, no? There are some ministries that do some things. There are some divisions within the city that do some things. The dynamic within the national government and the subnational government. But at least there could be something, no? So good news is this has been done somewhere else. In Korea, there was a seawall that cost a lot of $15 billion. Semangum seawall, it was funded with 50% of private capital. So they did the magic, sort of like. Sydney has some other flood risk reduction measures that also managed to leverage this amount of money. In the US, you also have that, no? So to conclude, I think this is the key. It's not easy, the collaboration, but also aligning the interest, right? And making the pie bigger, no? Because moral hazard comes like when the interests sometimes are not aligned and someone is having a free ride, right? But you can play the enforcement card, or you can say, let's work together. Let's make. We're gonna help you make money, and we're gonna also protect our cities. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Luis, for your comments. I would like to open up for Q&A. For those who are connected online, you may wish to raise your hand or type your questions in the comment. And I also had to ask colleagues in the conference room. Maybe Nancy can sort of coordinate and take the questions from the audience as well.
Perfect. We have 3 here. I don't know if we have anything online.
Maybe we can start with the audience in the conference room, and then I'll check on my end. Thank you. I don't think we have any hand up just yet. Thank you.
Just quick.
You want to come to the podium and ask your question from here? Should we have several, or do you want one by one?
Why don't we take some questions together and then turn to, Professor Shao or Luis? Thank you.
Alan, big fan of your work. When you said you had a 5-pager, I thought you meant the one you did last year, but no, you have a new one this year already. So very cool. My only question, and I'm sure you've thought about this, is we're faced with the same issue that we're not capturing adaptation action. So, when you compare rich to poor cities, you'd be worried that the richer cities are more defended than the poorer cities. But on top of that, the OSM, my understanding of OpenStreetMap is that the richer areas are updated by crowdsourcing, et cetera, more than the poorer areas. So maybe you will notice more, hospitals, et cetera, exposed to floods just by sampling design. So I'm sure you've thought about this, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this. Thanks.
Yeah, this is great work, by the way. I just have a big picture question. I know that you mentioned that you're working with quantitative spatial equilibrium models to try to understand, what are going to be the effect of this flooding on city shape. And I'm wondering if you have some thoughts on whether we should think about interregional migration, right? Because we have cities all over the place, and maybe it's just efficient for people to move out of the cities that have, flooding risk, and they just go to the mountains. And
Yeah, many thanks on great presentation. Really enjoyed it. 2 questions. I just wonder in terms of like the use of nighttime lights data to be able to capture intra-city differences between rich and poor neighborhoods. And I love nighttime lights data, I use it all the time, but I tend to be a little bit skeptical once we get to the intra-city level in terms of using that to capture richer versus poorer neighborhoods. Lights tend to be associated with infrastructure. Of course, infrastructure is your kind of outcome in some ways. And so like the brightest part of any city tends to be its airport, if it's got airport or its street lighting, that kind of thing. So maybe the lights are capturing infrastructure more than income within cities. And, there are alternatives, I guess, maybe Meta's relative wealth index. It's not quite global, but it's kind of all middle income countries and lower, 89 countries, I think. Not quite as fine a resolution, but not bad. Season do have a relative deprivation index that's got a 1 kilometer resolution, and so a little bit better than the relative wealth index. So that's question number 1. Question number 2 about Jakarta, and apologies if not read the paper, and so maybe this is a very naive question. In some ways, in the Indonesian government has made a pretty big commitment in terms of the building of a new capital city, in terms of, as a signal that maybe development should be moving away from Jakarta, and Jakarta no longer being the capital. And so just wondering if, you do look at the kind of capital relocation question. I know other people have papers on the relocation of the capital in terms of your modeling analysis of sea level rise for Jakarta and welfare implications.
I can respond very quickly to all the questions. We'll start with Mark. Yes, in the paper, one of the counterfactuals is thinking about the new capital city, and it's exactly helping to draw demand from Jakarta and thereby reducing the moral hazard issue. Two, for nighttime lights, I'm only using nighttime lights to think about rich versus poor neighborhoods within a city. So the only thing I'm doing is I'm saying within Jakarta, let me try to cut half of Jakarta into richer and half of Jakarta into poorer based on nightlight intensity within Jakarta. The cross-city comparison is all coming from country-level GDP, because I was worried I had exactly the same concern that across cities, nightlights are less comparable. So all of the nightlight comparison is just within a city, but maybe subject within a city to still some of those concerns, but I think less so than the intra-city comparison. To Paul, for the inter-regional migration, I do have the for interregional migration, I do have that in the Jakarta paper. I don't have any quantitative spatial model in this descriptive paper that I just presented, but in the main Jakarta paper, that's the core of the city to the periphery of the city. I have that. With these models, you just have to draw the line somewhere for how much migration you want to model, and that just depends on the data that one has, and so that's where I drew the line there. And then lastly, to CAPS, the OSM bias is totally well taken. That was the data set that I thought was geocoded for infrastructure. But all the code are available online, and so if anyone has better geocoded spatial data, it's easy for that to be incorporated.
Thank you. I would like to turn to our colleagues who are connected online. Please feel free to raise your hand. I'm looking now, but I don't think we have any colleagues with questions. I'm going to give one more chance before we turn to colleagues in the conference room. Nancy, do we have more questions from the conference room?
Yes, we have two more.
Okay, let's hear from them. Thank you.
Very much. Really like this presentation, a lot of very useful insights. So this is maybe going a little bit beyond your presentation and also in connection with Professor Kwang's presentation. So we face this classic problem that, if you have more floods or sea level rise, if you build more infrastructure, invest more, and then the land becomes safer and people continue to settle and you keep investing, etc. So this trade-off, how you build infrastructure to have safe lands against sea level rise or flooding, while also discouraging people from settling in high-risk areas. So it's always kind of chicken and egg how it comes. Just wonder, today we have professors here understanding what's the latest thinking or the modeling, or if you have any already some research on this area. I'd like to hear some refreshing perspectives. Thank you.
I think we're only fair to much time.
I'll just comment briefly, and then we can move on to the next presentation. In a way, my main Jakarta paper is all about that very delicate balance between how do we save people who are there now and how do we discourage more people from moving into the place and making the whole problem even worse, especially over the long run. Claire Balboni's recent AER paper also has a bit of this short run versus long run flavor. Those, and Unji's work as well, those I think are the kind of main papers really trying to think about this very careful chicken and egg problem in a disciplined way. Thank you.
Thank you. We had also online, thank you very much. We also had online question on other countries' approach to sea level rise, but I think we can let that discussion after the presentation. So thank you very much for the presentation to our participant, and also really good questions. So let's move to the next in the interest of time. I would like to invite now Stephen Rubini to discuss and share his work in Tuduk City in broader Ho Chi Minh City metropolitan area. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. First, I knew I'd be getting the microphone right away. So just to say that I work in Thailand as well as in Vietnam. I'm going to be talking about Vietnam today, but that statistic on sea level rise in Thailand was yikes for me. We, of course, in 2011, big floods in Bangkok, and I think top 5 in terms of loss of all time. And so one of the things we've been working on is how to diversify away from Bangkok into secondary cities. So if anybody's interested in that work, this is on Thailand Economic Monitor on secondary cities, as Bangkok is really one of the most primate cities in the world. But today I'm going to be talking about some of our work in Vietnam. In particular, a spatial CG analysis that we're doing in Thu Duc City, which is a special administrative area within Ho Chi Minh City. I want to start by saying that what we're really going to focus on, there's no discussant in this section because we don't have the results yet. But what I'm quite keen to do with this work is to connect some of the work that we would do at more of an academic level, looking at some of these macro models, thinking how they can be actually applied to look at policy and investment options within cities that they're already considering. And you'll see that this is quite a unique case in Thu Duc City. And I'm trying, it's so short. I get it. Okay. Is this better? Can you hear me? A little bit. You keep talking. Okay. So the objective of the study is to really look at some of the economic potential of Thu Duc City, look at some of the levers of sustainable and resilient growth. I'll get into the particular context for why this makes so much sense here. But we see Thu Duc City as one of probably the largest land development opportunities in Asia. In Vietnam, they've prioritized this by creating this special administrative unit within Ho Chi Minh City that has special powers and is really focused on its spatial development. So they've engaged the World Bank in trying to figure out how they can best develop this area. And this is something that we'll see in the next slide. But the main driver of why this hasn't been developed before is flood risk. And this gets into a lot of the same issues that we've been investigating before. So the model that we're doing is a spatial computable general equilibrium model. I think it's been mentioned as well in several of the presentations. The reason that we're using this model is because it can really pick up on some of really help us understand the spatial trajectory of growth and how different types of investments and policy decisions can impact that. And what we want to do is translate that to what sort of gross value addition would come from different scenarios of investments and policy decisions. And those are the levers that we'd be presenting to the city. One thing we're really trying to do with this is sort of push this type of modeling. So this modeling has been done quite a bit at the regional level. What we're trying to do is see how granular can we get with this where it still makes sense. And so I'm going to share some of the assumptions that we're making in the modeling. And you can see how it really takes a bit of a leap of faith in certain areas to make this work. And we need to be quite careful with how models like this are applied. So I talked about this a bit. Spatial CG modeling, there are some of these advantages, and I think one of the key advantages from our side is that we're really trying to provide a bigger narrative with Ho Chi Minh City about why they need to prioritize Thu Duc City and why it's so important to get the investments right and how that can impact the fabric of the city going forward. What we typically do at the World Bank, and is if we're working on a type of intervention in a city on different investments that we'd be making, is we have standard ways that we go about sort of a cost-benefit analysis of those interventions. And this is something that works really well. We need to include this. We need that level of detail and granularity, but it doesn't necessarily paint the whole picture. It doesn't paint the picture of the impacts of these types of interventions on, say, a broader urban agglomeration. And because Tudak City is so important and it presents such a good opportunity for investment in the city, we decided that this is an area that we need to look into a bit more and from a slightly broader perspective in order to capture all of the benefits from a larger investment program in Ho Chi Minh City. And I wanted to just give an example of how this sort of modeling has been applied in the past. The one that I'm most familiar with took place in Dhaka. There's a report called Toward Greater Dhaka. And you can see in the yellow, there's this highlighted area. That's East Dhaka, and it faced the same sort of issues. This was a very highly flood-prone area. In the past, urban expansion hadn't gone in that direction because it was so flood-prone. But due to a lot of the pressures that have been mentioned before, it has started to go that way. So you have private developers filling land, building developments. And so the idea was, okay, we want to do some modeling to look at what would happen if the government proactively made investments that protected the area, that provided the transport that was needed, rather than this sort of reactionary approach where you sort of have this encroachment into flood-prone areas due to the pressures that were mentioned earlier for increasing land prices, where they're really willing to look the other way and do localized interventions to reduce flood risk rather than wait for for infrastructure or policy solutions. Just to flag that that this work was led by Julia Bird. She was one of the researchers on this, and we've brought her on to work with us as well. And so there's some continuity from this. Also, Tony Venables. So this SCGE modeling at the urban level. This is sort of the same team going throughout from the Toward Greater Dhaka report. Another example of this was with the IGC. They estimated the impacts of Cape Town BRT. This really pushed the boundaries in terms of individual investments or typologies of investments and how that could impact the broader trajectory of spatial growth within a city, and to quantify the benefits that would come from it in a way where you'd start to get things like the GVA from different scenarios. So this is Ho Chi Minh City today. You can see that the growth has sort of gone northwest to southeast. This has been limited due to geography, due to flood risk. Ho Chi Minh City is quite flood prone. They've made lots of investments in flood protection. It's also quite congested, but it is the commercial capital of Vietnam. It is the central business district, as you can see, is right here, and the yellow, that is Tudak City, and that is the area that next slide you can see is underdeveloped. It's really at the midpoint between technology, education, and research. One of the key things here is that not only do you have the central business district directly west of it, you also have the emerging industrial areas to the east and to the southeast. So you have Dong Nai and Vung Tau, and those areas are connected to large port projects and investments. And so we thought that SCGE model could be a good application to look at how this connects to the broader development of the region rather than just specific area of the city. The city aims, for example, to have they have their goals. I think they're aiming to have about 30% of the country's output in Ho Chi Minh City, or of Ho Chi Minh City, be within Tudak City in the next 30 years. So this is an area that they've really prioritized as one that they want to develop. And the question that they're asking us now is how? How can we develop this in a way that provides the greatest value addition for the city, while also making sure that we're dealing with issues like flood risk and urban connectivity, so that they can hit some of their targets. And to hammer this point home, you can see that if you look at distance from the center, the city center, and population density in Tudak City on the left, it's way below what it should be if this were sort of a standard model of development. And there are no mountains, there are no geographic constraints in Ho Chi Minh City outside of this real flood risk. And so that is what you're seeing here, and that's why we thought it could be a good application of this type of model to look at flood risk. Try to be a little interactive. What do you see here? Could somebody raise their hand in terms of the changes over time in the development of Tudak City? So the boundary is Tudak City. Top left, 1990, lower right, 2020. Anyone?
Disappear between 2010 and 2020 is
Yeah. So there's a couple things going on here. First, I think you can see that the boundary is along a waterway, it's along a river, and those are the flood-prone areas. I think Caps showed in one of her slides an area in Vietnam where you see that some of this development is being built up in flood-prone areas. And that's what happened here. So from 1990 till 2010, you see all of this development happening, and that's largely due to the fact that the government didn't intervene. There were a lot of slums that were built, and you had this exposure that was really would flood quite often, every 5 years or so in different areas. Still, by 2010, you see the lower right-hand corner of Tudak City. It's still quite green, which shows just how flood-prone it is, because this is an area that is 10 kilometers from the central business district. This right here is District 1 on the far left. So there are these tremendous advantages. The land prices are incredibly high, but they're dealing with this flood risk. And the reason you see the sort of gap from 2010 to 2020 is that is when the government really started to intervene on some of these policy measures related to flood risk. They started to make some of these interventions focus on retention ponds. They passed some policy measures in the city, for example, that you have to have retention on your area if you're going to develop up. So sort of localized retention, which in a way is some sort of private form of value capture to deal with some of these retention issues. So they are thinking it through, but at this point in time, they're relying on us to try to figure out what could some sort of investment profile look like that could help to catalyze the growth of the area in the long term in a resilient manner that really capitalizes on its location and its economic potential. So what we did is we partnered with Royal Haskoning DHV. This is sort of the traditional flood risk assessment that World Bank teams will do with our clients all around the world to identify what types of interventions are needed. And these tend to be engineering solutions mixed with nature-based solutions. There are whole different plans that were put together in 3 different phases. And the traditional way that we would do this is we would do a cost-benefit analysis based on expected annual damage within the area. And that's something that I think does a very good job of capturing the local impacts of these investments. But again, what we need to do with the city is to communicate why investing in Tudak holistically, not just in terms of flood control infrastructure, but in terms of connectivity, everything else makes sense as a priority for Ho Chi Minh City broadly and their development priorities. So this is where the SCGE model fits in, and on the approach, we wanted to make sure a couple things. One is that we had spatial interaction with Greater Ho Chi Minh City. This includes the broader region, as I mentioned, beyond the Ho Chi Minh City built up area, including areas around it like Dong Nai and Vung Tau that are rapidly expanding and have a large industrial presence and an increasing one. Yeah, I think I covered most of this already, but I think that the two areas that have been the priority in terms of investments with Tudak City are around connectivity and flood protection. So the scenarios that we wanted to develop are really focused on those two pieces of that. I won't get into the literature much on SCGE modeling, as I think we've talked about this, and some of these pieces are very sort of seminal works to us that we all are familiar with, but within Ho Chi Minh City, this is sort of having these conversations around the opposing forces of agglomeration and dispersion. Those are things that I think have been really helpful for showing the World Bank's value addition with our city level counterparts. The pillars that we're looking at within the model, households, firms, developers, trade. I won't get into that here. It's still in flux, but just to sort of put how we're looking at it for our IO table here. For example, is feeding into this. We have different types of households, different types of firms. I think manufacturing was quite important for us because of the proximity to it. These will be circulated so you can look into it a bit more, but and we're really trying to calibrate it with the current day. So key to developing this model has been our close coordination with our counterparts in the city to make sure that it's grounded. The model computes the equilibrium, and the idea of this is essentially to get to a point where we can get to the GVA of different policy scenarios. So this is sort of the key piece here. We haven't, we're developing the scenarios at the moment, but I think this does a good job of sort of highlighting some of the strengths and weaknesses of an SCGE model to look at these types of interventions in the granular way that we're trying to do at the city. Because we have the business as usual scenario, which again means that development will continue to encroach in these areas, but it won't be done in a way that that includes the types of investments that could potentially unlock the additional value that we're shooting for. And then we're looking at flood improvement. There's the phases 2 and 3, and then additional transport investments to look at connectivity. Again, this is to try to connect to the broader development objectives of Ho Chi Minh City, not just these particular investments that the World Bank were really interested in financing, because it needs to be part of this broader package. The assumptions here, this is where I think a lot of the limitations in our model and the granularity in which we're able to look at these types of scenarios get us to. So, for example, if you look at flood improvement, in the work that we did with Royal Haskoning, we can look at the reduction in flood risk for these types of interventions. But at the end of the day, for the model, it's going to look at just sort of a decrease in exposure for flooding. How does that translate into an SCGE model, and how does that impact the broader areas around it as you get further and further away? Same thing with connectivity, and so reduction in travel times to and from Tudak. Right now, it's about 10 kilometers away from Central Business District. It's not very well connected to the emerging economic corridors and the ports and industrial areas. So we want to look into this and see what will the GVA be for each of these. So I'll stop there, and happy to take questions on some of the details, but this is work that we're doing that we're hoping to get the results by the end of June. And again, key to this is really fitting into our broader dialogue with Ho Chi Minh City on a multi-year investment agenda in which we'll play a small part, but hopefully can provide some guidance in terms of what makes the most sense.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Let's open up also cognizant of the time. So maybe from the audience side, Nancy, you could help. And then also those connected online, please raise your hand or leave your questions in the chat box. Thank you.
So do we have any questions in the room?
I can ask a question.
Remy.
I'll come here. Does it work? It works? Okay, great. Yeah, I think what I find fascinating is that you say this is one of the biggest land opportunities in Asia, or maybe the world. And I was wondering, like, this was done in Singapore or Hong Kong in the past when they also had a lot of land reclamation. Do we have estimate of the cost at the time and the benefits? And how do they compare to the costs? And the benefits, you don't have the benefits yet, but I didn't get the cost in the case of your policy. How much will it cost to reclaim the land, dry it, and make it safe? And what are the benefits, and what can we learn from past experiences in Asia? I was going to say we're in Foggy Bottom as well. And, this was drained and reclaimed 2 centuries ago, and we're also very close to CBD, so that's actually very similar.
Super interesting. And then as an academic researcher, it's always really cool. It's like a dream to see like sort of this kind of academic tool can be used as a sort of really policy making. So I think I kudos to World Bank for that. And the question, and then it's less about the sea level rise related, but it's more about the case study that I'm from South Korea, and then South Korea had this they move sort of like they made DC, sort of quote unquote DC out of Seoul. But I think it is similar, probably similar to the situation that um, Vietnam is facing, that it was too far away, that the agglomeration benefit cannot be generated. So no one wants to move there basically because it was too far away. They did another attempt, which they made it right next to Seoul core. And then now it's just like Seoul became even mega city. So it's like Pangyo and the Seoul became mega city. So I think the distance to the core, and then it really depends on what you choose as a parameters basically about the agglomeration benefits and stuff like that. But um, is that the only option that you guys are thinking, or are they thinking? And then have they given enough thought of, is it, if it is too remote, no one wants to move there, so there should be like a government force to move economic activity there because none of the market mechanism will go there. So I was wondering whether the kind of thoughts has been given this project.
Stephen, before I hand over to you, we also have 2 questions from online. One colleague asked potential resistance to change, I guess public resistance to change. Not entirely clear what change this he or she was referring to, but there was one question. The other one was from Catherine Nicholson. In the developer's decision, is flooded land directly incorporated in their decision making? For instance, when developers choose where to locate in the city, do they choose using any knowledge of flood risk? So these were the 2 questions posed to you. If you could also address that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. Okay, so to the first question, the 3 phases of investment that they've identified, which would effectively protect Tudak City, that's about $1.5 billion of investment required. The real money though is in the real estate, and right now, what you're seeing, and this gets a bit to another question as well, is you have these large real estate developers that are buying up plots of land in Tudak and doing this sort of localized protection on their area, and it's in a bit of a haphazard way where they'll protect their plot at the expense of their neighbors. and they'll build up, and you know, this land is worth billions and billions of dollars without you know, without any interventions whatsoever. You know, what we saw in Dhaka, for example, is the developers, they would fill the land to a point, you know, they would dredge from the river, fill the land, get to a point where it wasn't flooding, and they would do it themselves if they needed to, because the pressures to develop this area are so strong, given that it's only 10 kilometers from the central business district. And you know, you've seen that in different areas, and you're seeing it in the rest of them going forward. In terms of getting people to move there, this is I think one of the big challenges is that the government and everybody sees this opportunity. This isn't a supply-driven issue where you're thinking about where should we put people, that sort of thing. This is an area that, you know, is being, you know, is underdeveloped, but is being, you know, the land is valued extremely high. It's being developed in these strange ways where, you know, in the middle of a rice paddy, you'll have a 30-story building that's developed by a private developer at this point. And so I think when we meet, you know, they know this because they created the special administrative unit, Tudak City. Nobody really knows what it means. It's sort of in between, you know, like a city and a district. They still need ultimate approval from Ho Chi Minh City for investments, but they have another degree of autonomy. And when we meet them, I think one of the challenges is to temper their expectations for it. So the amount of times I've heard them compare it to, say that it's going to be, you know, the future Cannery Wharf or something is, you know, you know, maybe they'll get there, but you know, they want to be some AI tech finance hub. And so we need to find some sort of way to say, you know, like, look, this is an area that has a lot of potential. Let's focus on the fundamentals of the infrastructure that you need for it to develop in a responsible way. And then, you know, you can focus on some of the incentives and policy levers to get the types of development that you want. In terms of just the question on resistance, I think that, you know, one of the key challenges is that, and this gets a bit more broadly to the question around flood protection, is that often in Vietnam in particular, poor people tend to go to the more flood-prone areas. They know how to deal with it. They adapt to it in local ways. You know, like the houses will be on stilts. That's not oftentimes not permanent in the way that, you know, we think about a permanent development. And so you're having these large developers in a way intimidating these, you know, smaller landholders or these informal landholders. And we need to find some way to manage that. And that's something that, you know, isn't exclusive to Tudak City, but I think, you know, it's something that in Vietnam in particular is always going to be a challenge when we're thinking through flood protection programs. And I think that covered them. Yeah.
Thank you, Steven. Unfortunately, he had to disconnect. She had to run to another meeting, but I think that's a good segue to our next session.
Thank you.
Okay. To show you the results of 2 papers and a project that we're just starting on this issue. But, you know, generally what we've seen is, yeah, we've got implicit probabilities of having problems with flooding and all sorts of fires and all other sort of like issues. Increased risks. So the second moment, the variance is not only that's more probable that we're going to have flooding, but also we're going to have flooding at different times in different areas with different variability that is increasing. And finally, we have increasing exposure as we have more people living in the areas. And I think there was a paper about this morning. There's more people living in the areas that are exposed to these hazards. So again, the issues are rain, flash floods that we saw, for instance, in Valencia, Spain, only 6 months ago, hurricanes, typhoons, storms that we see the increased prevalence certainly in Florida and the Gulf of Mexico, tsunamis, because we have more people living in low areas. The AMOC, that's something that, you know, it's not clear that it's on people's radar, but that's a big one if really we have the change in that I think it's Atlantic meridional overturning current. If it changes direction, then it's really going to be very problematic. Obviously, sea level rise, that's at high tide levels, but also combined with the others, then you get much more problems. I'm going to show you that we're slightly more pessimistic than you are with that respect. These issues are becoming really more certain and uninsurable. At this point, we're talking about risk before, but now we're talking about sort of really uninsured issues. So we might have in some areas loss of urban land, increased fragmentation, and then obviously in some of these areas you're going to see optimal retreat. So we're going to talk a little bit about this, but I'll do this in three papers or in three ideas. The first paper is really a paper that's published that my co-author is a geographer, so we published this in Environment and Planning, and it's really about traffic delays and the fact that cities that are sort of non-convex, so if you compare these two cities, if you look at the land availability around the center of the city, it's the same. About 50% of the city can be developed. The issue though is that the city, this first city here is it's a very compact set, it's a convex set. Okay, so if you draw any segment between any 2 points, you're always going to lie within the city. Whereas this city is very non-convex. Okay, this is related, but not exactly the same as the concept of Harari's cities in bad shape. She's really in her paper. If you have a city that's rectangular but very elongated, it's in very bad shape because as you increase the city, you're going to get farther and farther away from the center, but it would be a very compact, convex set. So really, we're going to measure this idea. We're going to measure this non-convexity between a random set of points within each of the city. It's a city. For this, we chose Boston. So what we did is we drew a number of different sort of axes along the center of the city, and then we draw all the potential commuting between any of these points. So we got sort of like a large number of potential starts and finishes that span through all the directions. And therefore, if you look at the minimum road distance, we're going to calculate what's the minimum road distance using OSM, OpenStreetMaps. We have almost full coverage of all the roads that you're going to take to drive from one place to the other, the city. Okay, so then what we find, and I'm going to just show you graphs here and beautiful maps and pictures because we all love it. But you can read the paper and we do this analytically. We look at the data. We calculate for each of these origin destination combinations. We calculate the travel time, the road time, sort of peak congestion, so on and so forth. So the first effect is obvious, okay? So you didn't need a PhD in economics to really understand that if you have 2 points that are separated, there's a lot of non-convexity. So these 2 points here are separated by a lot of the ocean, okay? So there's a lot of non-convexities. And that we're gonna measure by the share of the segment between the 2 points that is actually without the compact sect. So this is the ocean or actually mountains or other bodies of water. So in this area, we see clearly a lot of impediments, and that what you're gonna tend to see, obviously, is that the minimum road distance between these 2 points is much, much larger. Okay, that's kind of obvious, but again, we can measure this if you look at all different points in the geography of Boston, and we're working on the US, so we're gonna do this for the whole US. I'm gonna tell you exactly what is this non-convexity issue. But more importantly, in cities like Boston, where you have this is a very non-convex set, because again, the ocean is actually intruding, a very classical port city, where you have a port, you're sheltering from the elements, and the water really comes in and intrudes into the city. And here, what you're gonna tend to see, not only that you have to go from point B to point A that have a lot of ocean in between, not only have to take more of a detour, obvious, but also this detour here cannot avoid bypass through the center of the city. What we calculated using sort of the overall distribution of trips in Boston is actually about 15%. I think it's 13% of the trips in Boston are actually generated by people who commute from the north to the south, and they have to go through either the downtown or do a large detour via the 95, which is super congested. So about 1 in 6 people, when you drive downtown Boston and you hate it because there's so many people there, 1 in 6 of them are just condemned by having to bypass the downtown. Obviously, if you go from point C to D, here on the west side of the city, not only it's shorter, but it's also not going through the downtown, okay? So that's effect number 2 of convex geographies. Effect number 3, likely because of the 2 first effects and another one that I'm going to show you, whenever you have 2 points that are separated by a barrier, you have less commuting between the 2. And that we do by using all these random points through the city and using origin and destination fixed effects, meaning that I'm just identified of, okay, from this point, I'm looking at that point over there, and there's no barrier, and comparing what happens from the same origin point to what happens to a point in the same distance, but now there's a barrier between the 2. And what we find is that the deterrent effect of these non-convexities is much bigger, so we have less commuting between these 2 points. Finally, and even less intuitively, I think, we find a 5th effect in Boston, which is the proximity effect. Even if you drove from 2 points that are within the set of potentially, interior points in Boston, if you're driving very close to the ocean, you're going to tend to have more congestion. Why is that? Well, we first drew a buffer of 5 kilometers around the ocean, and then we look at all the apps, these 20,000 combinations of origin destinations. And we look at all the trips, the time of the trip, the distance of the trip. And what we find is that if the more the trip happens within 2 points that are within this buffer, the slower is the trip. And why is that? We think that this is similar to the phenomenon in physics, which is the heat equation. If you guys remember from your physics in high school or college, the heat equation tells you that if you have like a rod, you hit it at the center, because the heat diffuses on both directions, it's going to diffuse much more faster. So if you have a point where you have more traffic, but if you're very close to this area, the only way to bypass is by using this side. You cannot bypass on the ocean side. So at congestion points, you tend to have the diffusion process. It's a very classical heat diffusion process. The heat or traffic doesn't diffuse well from these areas at peak points. Okay, and that's exactly what we find. So these places tend to have more, if you're closer, if the share of your drive of the shortest path between 2 points goes through the ocean a lot, then you tend to have more driving, and especially true, almost all of the effect happens in peak time, which is exactly what a heat diffusion model. So being fragmentation and closeness to the ocean really do matter for this transportation, and not only for transportation, but economic outcomes, because we see jobs and people sort of like sorting in ways. And this is, certainly we're not modeling this, like this is a general equilibrium. We see the people and jobs sorting in a way that's consistent with the idea that you avoid these barriers. The second paper I want to talk about is, it's come just in Nature Cities with the same co-author, Lu Yao, Wang, who's at Wuhan University, by the way. And here we talk about, again, we did the same measurements for all cities in the world. And, we've talked a lot about urban density. There's a very famous example for those of you who were students in the 90s or in the early 2000s, perhaps. I'm pushing here, but there was the Barcelona, Atlanta. They had in the 90s, in the 1990s, they had the same population, but Atlanta was 20 times bigger in area. And certainly the planning is very different. I'm from Barcelona originally. We do have the best planning in the world. But okay, that was a joke, by the way. Second best, probably. But it's not only the planning. The truth is that the city is sandwiched between the ocean and the mountains. And that must have affected the way in which they plan the city. Okay, you can see a lot of examples. Oslo is much more non-convex than Helsinki, although they're both pretty rough cities in terms of non-convexity. And you tend to see that, these cities to be much, much denser. By the way, Madrid is 5 times less dense than Barcelona. And it's very similar planning culture. Okay, but they don't have any constraints up to 30, 40 kilometers away. So obviously barriers don't matter in most places, okay? So if you look at the distribution of these measures of non-convexity, I'm going to show you in a minute, in most cities, maybe up to the 75th percentile, this doesn't matter a lot. But where it matters a lot. So if you look at the distribution of population, the urban extent in Japan and the plains in Japan, doesn't take a lens to realize that the distribution of population is fully driven by geography, okay, where it's flat. That's where they built, okay? So now what we did in this paper is to look at different city definitions. We used the GAHS2, the UCDB, but also the AUE for like the 300 cities, JHUV. And obviously you can come up with different definitions of cities depending on whether you're just measuring reflection from like pavements and things like that, or you're looking at populations, combining censuses and gridded census data, or lights. And there's many ways in which you can, and how you measure contiguity from one grid to the other. There's many ways in which you can define cities. We use 4, just to be sure, okay? But our reference is JHS. We did find that 2019 version, because you guys work with this, the 2019 version had a lot of mistakes for the smaller cities. 2024 update is much better. So you really want to update those papers and with the latest update. Then we use all sorts of other gridded data, and the quality, as you guys, I don't need to tell you because you're working on these issues. The quality is, you don't know exactly, but that's the best we have right now. Population, oceans, well, this is pretty good. Precipitation, elevation, gross domestic product by grid. So these are all now we're blessed with a lot of gridded data that now you can sort of apply to any boundaries. So we merged the city boundaries to all of these gridded data. That's the beauty of having a co-author who's a GIS expert. And then we calculate 3 variables. The classical, sort of like the one that I use in my 2010 paper on the share of barriers. So we draw radiuses of 5 kilometers and 10 kilometers around each city. We calculate how much land is lost to mountains, oceans, and inland water, water inlets. Then we calculate this non-convexity measure. We randomly, we draw points in a uniform way around these circles, a lot of points, and then we calculate all the dyadic sort of distances between the segments, and we calculate how much water or mountains is in between. So then that we come up with an average measurement of non-convexity. Now, if you add up for all potential points, obviously you'd get the exact measure of non-convexity, but we got a very uniform sample that's really good. And then we calculate also using OpenStreetMaps, we calculate the tour factor, which is, again, by looking at all this uniform distribution around a circle of the downtown of the city as weighted, by the way, it's a centric weighted by population using the gridded data. Then we calculated the tour between any 2 points by using what's the minimum road distance between the 2 points in OpenStreetMaps. Shortest point is not necessarily the one that's fastest, but just as an approximation there. So what we find is that, as a matter of fact, again, barriers don't matter in most places. Most places have very low non-convexities, so they're very compact set cities. But for the ones that where this matters, again, we're looking at the 65, 75 percentile through the top. They matter a lot. So for this average non-convexity at the city level explains a lot of the detours, the average detour between all these points. So places where you have a lot of these internal non-convexities, you do have a lot of, which requires infrastructure. We make in this paper, we made a case for actually the central governments provide measurements of fragmentation to actually target infrastructure where it's most needed. In these areas that are more mountainous, or they're separated by coasts in ways that make sense. Because you're going to have much harder transportation. And that's true controlling for a lot of things, GDP, so on and so forth. As a matter of fact, if you put just the share of land available for development around downtown and the non-convexity is going to matter much more for transportation, for the distance between 2 places. Then we just, again, these are all descriptive. We finalize with just looking at the correlations between this measure of non-convexity and a number of city outcomes using the 4 definitions of cities. 5 actually, because we use both the 19 vintage of the UCDB and the 23 vintage, which is published in 25 or 24. So what we find is basically we tend to see associations such that cities that have a lot of non-convexities of, two random places are separated by either a mountain or water, like in Boston, you tend to have less population, higher densities, more saturation, so there's relatively less share of built-up area. You have lower GDP per capita, and that's true because you can argue, well, this is all, these are all result of the fact they have less population. If they have less population, they have less GDP, agglomeration, so on and so forth, less density. But if you control for both population and income, you still find the same results. And by the way, even controlling for population and income, they have higher building heights. That makes a lot of sense because you have higher densities. Although, as you know, there's many ways in which you can get densities without building higher, okay? Setbacks. Okay, so let me go to the third project. And we're really just started this project. And this is ongoing. Again, with the same co-author, Luyao Wang. Here we're looking, so the issue here is we're not so worried about necessarily land loss, but about fragmentation. So I think if you, fragmentation, transportation, and transportation infrastructure. Okay? So we worry about land fragmentation because even if you don't lose a lot of land, even if you lose 10% of the land, if the land is dividing the city in two parts, you have a very fragmented city, and that's going to affect a lot the transportation. So these measurements of land loss are, in our view, are underestimates of really the big impact that this can have. Okay, so we're going to use very similar sources, DM data, coastal dam, sea level rise data from NASA, city boundary data from UCDB, and then the global tide and surge reanalysis. And we're going to be way more pessimistic than you. And why is that? Because we're using a bathtub model. Okay, in a bathtub model, anything that's below water level, and water level, it's the highest tide plus surges. Actually, it does take into account surges. I say no, but it does take into account surges. Plus surges from hurricanes, and the water is pushed by the wind and wind, really. And we're using a bathtub model, which means that if you're below sea level, we assume that you're flooded. You'll see that 1 meter gets you to the scenarios that you have at 3, 4, 5 meters using a bathtub model, which I was checking because when I saw your thing, I was like, did we do it wrong? But it's truly so sensitive to the specification. I now realize from your presentation, and it's not that they're wrong, but really, really, there's a lot of assumptions there about what's actually going to get flooded. No? So if you're below sea level, any storm might actually, water may be hard to get in, but it's really hard to get out once it gets in. So it's unclear. There's a lot of uncertainty, obviously, about these issues. So probably you can think of us as being the most pessimistic scenario that you can imagine. It's comparable to your 5 meter, like with the elevation model. So if you do we're also going to assume that we're going to the worst case scenario. And I don't think, unfortunately, that's any more sort of worst. So it's IPCC SSP 5285 in 2000, so super pessimistic, super high temperatures. Anything that's below water level is going to get water eventually, okay? So we got that 70 cities are also submerged under these very radical scenarios. And we check with the Climate Central model, which is it's really a couple of Princeton professors who decided their research grants make more sense on a NGO because you don't have to pay the oversight. But there's a really large team. They're looking at that 1 meter. That's about 1 meter, and that's what we got much larger at the bathtub level. We got much at 1 meter only. Ho Chi Minh's gone. Okay, I mean, and again, a lot depends on whether the water you kept at bay that water. Okay. Okay, so then what we do is using these boundaries, we look at which cities are disappearing, meaning that more than 90% is gone. Shanghai, as you showed, it's gone using this bathtub assumption. Then you have Tianjin there's actually only a few areas of the city. However, to be honest with you, there's about 40 or 50 cities for which this is an issue, okay? For many cities, there's gonna be a more kind of gradual withdrawal process whereby, say, in a city, and I think that's Tokyo, Japan, in a city like Tokyo, you're gonna have, if under this very negative scenario, you're gonna have withdrawal, but still the city is pretty compact. There's this Yokohama part here that's a bit disconnected, but the rest of the city is relatively connected. Or even Mumbai. So the city, you have to look, on this graph, you have to look only at the pink, disregard the blue. The blue is just the boundary for the polygons that we're using for the calculations of the ocean, because there's many of it. Disregard. So it's just the pink, and the white is actually gone, okay, under these radical scenarios. So these cities are retreating, but they're retreating in a way, in a way that's compact, that's convex, okay? Then there are cities like Dhaka and Ho Chi Minh that are fragmenting. Under these very strong scenarios, not only they're losing a lot of land, so all the white and blue, again, the white is under and the blue, it's the polygons of, so it's under too. So both white and blue are under, and the pink is what's left. Not only you lose a lot of the city, but again, going back to this issue of fragmentation, you get a very fragmented city. So transportation is going to become a huge issue. How do you get people from here to here? Okay, so even again, this is very radical, but even with much more modest sort of losses, transportation issues might become important if you have, like, depending on the shape of how the lowland lays. Okay, so that's Dhaka, sorry, that's Ho Chi Minh. So here again, the fragmentation of Ho Chi Minh grows by a lot. How am I on time? Okay. Okay. So now what we're doing. So we're really about, so we calculate fragmentation using this non-convexity. And by the way, there's all other measures of fragmentation in the literature, the one called compactness and the other fragmentation. Fragmentation is how many little islands you're gonna have, sort of how many separate polygons you create from one single polygon. And compactness has other sort of like, it's more about the shape of the whole polygon rather than the within distances between 2 points in the polygon. But they all go in the same direction. So it's not really brain surgery. Any of these would tell you the same issue, the type of issues. Okay, so then obviously you can come up with, hey, obviously, you know, these cities might, in the very negative scenario, lose a lot of land. But you know what? You know, because we're gonna have this, you know, for instance, in Jakarta, well, you just move back, or sort of like some places you think maybe we can retreat back. So problem is, for instance, in Miami, you cannot really retreat because you have the Everglades on your back, okay? Whereas in Boston, we have some laws. I'm not gonna show you here, but we have it in the paper, in the data. But you know, we can retreat a little bit back, okay? And if we ever allow building at higher density in Boston, then we can, you know, just like move. The ocean's coming and we're retreating. Not as big of a deal, okay? So then we really looked at how possible retreat is, okay? So we look at the three situations. If we have a lot of land, but high fragmentation. So if we have a lot of land left, but high fragmentation, then we have all these islands, and that city, unless you have really amazing transportation, is gonna become unviable. Situation number two, you still have, you don't have a lot of land, in which case that's it, you cannot move, no? You have to be in the land that you have left. And the third situation is where you have relatively a relatively high share of land, and you're relatively unfragmented. Okay, so let me show you what I mean by this. Okay, so the first thing we do is we calculate a radius that encompasses twice the current area of the city, sort of to envelope the city, okay? And that is actually Ho Chi Minh, okay? So it's Ho Chi Minh today. This is the, at least according to UCD, okay? This is the boundary, and now we draw a radius that would encompass twice the area of the city currently, okay? So that's what we do. That's the radius that given, and by the way, we take into account the fact that there are rivers, so we take that out. What is the radius that would accommodate the area of the city, taking out the fact that you have some areas that are not developable? So that's it, twice. So this is twice the radius today. So then we go to the flooding scenario, and we see that only these blue areas now, so my co-author changed the color to confuse me, but only these blue areas are now left, okay? Obviously, you can tell me, yeah, that's a problem because we have islands now. The fragmentation, the non-convexities are becoming real, the problem, more than the land, okay? But we still can retreat this way. In this direction, you see that if you move into this direction, you have an area that's actually now completely compact, okay? So despite the fact that, you know, it looks like the city is going to fragment a lot, if the city keeps moving in the direction of the optimal amount of land, you know, might be less of a problem. So now let's look at this. And again, this is speculative, it's 100 years in the future, 70 years in the future. But so let's do that. Let's draw that radius for each city, then find 50 random points around the city, which is uniform distribution. It's just a search, kind of a grid to search. And then for each of these points, we draw the same radius and calculate again the share of land that's not flooded, that's available, and the compactness, non-convexity. So in a way, if this is not a good place to be anymore, you still can move in the direction of other places, okay? So then we can look at what is this the optimal point? Probably not, no, because at this point, if you draw a radius, you're gonna see, oh, there's a lot of ocean and a lot of non-convexities between the interior points that are left, okay? But this point's probably better because, you know, if you draw a radius from this point, then you have a lot of land that's available and a lot of convex, you know, a lot of flat, you know, a lot of accessibility from that point. So that might be a better point than this point. If you do that with a lot of points, then you can compare points in terms of which are the optimal retreat strategies. This is northwest, this is southeast, this is, okay. So that's what we're doing now, okay? That's literally, this is like a spit by the computer 3 days ago. So here what we're doing is that we're starting to look at 3 types of cities, looking at cities. In these cities, for instance, you can either increase the amount of land that you get, but that's gonna come at the cost of decreasing the connectivity, okay? So some cities can retreat, like San Diego, but as you retreat, you start hitting mountains, and then the transportation becomes more complicated. So in these cities, you have a trade-off between getting to a place where there's more land to develop, but that land is slightly more fragmented. Fortunately, this is a minority of the cities. You have other types of cities where the relationship is unclear, okay? Or you might even have a minimum. So you have a point where you get a lot of land to develop, and it's very connected, less fragmented, okay? But in other cases, there's a bit of a trade-off to be made, okay? Depending on which direction you retreat. You go to the northeast, you might get more land, but you know what? There might be more fragmentation given the way in which the ocean is coming in, or the mountains. And finally, fortunately, and this is good news, I think, almost all of the cities that experience some serious potential flooding are like this. So in these cities, you tend to see that the optimal point tends to get you away from the city, and you get more land and more compact city shape. Although you end up in some of them, Dalian, for instance, you still end up with high levels of non-convexity. 20% is really high for that measure, okay? So in these cities, and we actually, once we have the paper, we're going to tell you exactly the latitude and longitude of this point to suggest which direction you should look for development, not only what's the optimal point, which is going to be here, but where this point is, no? The latitude and longitude. This is very early work, so I'm happy to provide, to do on-demand requests. If you have some measure metric that you think would be interesting to calculate, we can do it because we're just doing it, literally. So on-time requests are appreciated. Thank you very much.
Albert. So we have 10 minutes or so for Q&A. Let me just go online first to make sure that is not a question. If anyone online has questions, feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat. But right now, it looks like there isn't any. So does anyone in the room have a question?
Hello. Just a quick question. Do you think that non-convexities could also bring amenities, right? If I'm in a suburb in a neighborhood, I want it to be isolated. I don't want roads to be crossing nearby. And how do we interpret, your indices in the context that there may be some amenity value of non-convexities?
Yeah, and that's what I think Boston is a good example in the context of the first paper. We have a lot of people living there, but a lot of the people are going to commute to places that are on inland in a perpendicular way to the coast, so that they're avoiding. So it's about the jobs and sort of the costs of actually commuting, which is, I think, the big problem. Now, for this very last paper, obviously, it's not fun anymore when the ocean starts getting into, you have hurricanes and you have storms, and so at that point it becomes a hazard, regardless of the amenity value.
I was also really interested in the comparison between our two sets of analysis. I agree that just being below sea level versus for me below sea level plus connected to the ocean makes some difference. I don't know if that would be the whole difference between what we have. So I had two other thoughts. One was that our underlying elevation data are slightly different. But I don't know if that would cause the big discrepancy.
Yeah.
The other one minor note is that the global human settlement layer, those boundaries, one thing that I realized when I was working with those was that those boundaries include like lakes or rivers. And so I had to drop those lakes and rivers to be able to not overstate. Yeah, I think you're using coastal DEM, which comes from NASA DEM.
Yeah. So that might be one. No, because I also honestly, and it's good that we've met, because maybe that we're both wrong. It's not it's not about adjudicating. It's about learning, no? And
We start with the same boundaries, so maybe it's how we treat boundaries, or it's so it's one of those three.
yeah, I mean, Climate Central is one of the big references on these maps. And sort of like their baseline is a 1 meter. Again, it's a bathtub kind of model, but
I think this includes storm surges.
yes, it does include storm surges. That's probably and we do include storm surge. Absolutely, that might be part of the difference. Yeah.
Both right. It's not.
No. Again, but the problem though is that if the storms happen very often, even if the water is not there always, you don't want to be there. No, so we're using exactly, at the end of the day, we realized we're using, to be honest with you, we made it so we replicate, because we thought this was the golden standard. They wouldn't share their data. So we tried to replicate there, and we really nailed it. We really nailed it in terms of, but again, I think it's a salutary conversation, because what this really tells us is that the uncertainty is so large, Again, when water, even if water doesn't get in, but if it does get in, it's difficult to get out. So it's the uncertainty around these issues is really large.
you. I just want to say thank you so much for this really awesome presentation. I happened to learn a lot. And I apologize for asking a question that, again, is kind of on a conclusion that you're still somewhat working on, but just in your own just personal opinion, in your kind of, own sort of like, thoughts on this. What do you think about the focus, like future focus of transportation infrastructure? You know, should more be focused on, expanding into the more inland regions, as to, already have that infrastructure in place for if and when more land gets fragmented, or, what how much should we also just prioritize those sections that will be fragmented, so that those, islands aren't completely isolated, and thus there's such great inequality?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult question. I think that the first thing that you need is the metrics, not to know to what degree this is even an issue. So again, we're still looking very much at like just the loss, but the shape of the loss happens to be very, very important. And again, there's a few cities where this matters, but I mean, maybe 100, but it matters a lot for those cities. So I think having the metric would be at least interesting, no, to look at these scenarios, and that's why we'll put up this paper and the data also. Then you have to make trade-offs between sort of what's the retreat versus, because if you're opting for retreat, then the infrastructure has to move in the way that we sort of to optimize, like compactness of the city. And so I think it comes down to politics. I think that Jakarta is a great example, because I think implicitly or explicitly probably the politicians know already that that's a retreat, but they're certainly not framing it that way. They're framing it in a sort of like most like an innovation kind of frame. But there's political arguments there that make these decisions very difficult. But the more data that you present to the public, I think at least you can get some buy-in for either one of the other approach.
Do we have any more questions? Let's thank Albert.